At the start of the war, the oceans belonged to Japan, and almost no one questioned it. Across the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy moved with confidence earned through preparation, doctrine, and experience. Its carrier pilots were the best trained in the world. Its surface fleet was aggressive, disciplined, and feared. In the opening months, Japanese naval power seemed unstoppable, striking hard, far, and faster than anyone believed possible. And yet, within a few short years, that dominance vanished, not in one moment, not in one battle, but through a chain of decisions, assumptions, and losses that quietly dismantled superiority piece by piece. Japan did not lose the Pacific because it lacked courage or skill. It lost because naval power in a modern war demands more than early brilliance. It demands sustainability, and that was something Japan could not replace once it was gone. The first cracks appeared where victory had seemed most certain. Carrier warfare rewarded experience above all else. Japan's early successes were driven by elite air crews trained over years, not months. But those pilots were irreplaceable. Training pipelines were long, standards were high. And when losses began to mount, replacements arrived with fewer hours, less coordination, and diminished survivability. The United States learned the opposite lesson. After early defeats, the United States Navy rebuilt deliberately. Training expanded, doctrine adapted, radar, fighter direction, and carrier coordination improved rapidly. Where Japan protected quality at the expense of quantity, the United States pursued both. Then came the battles that exposed imbalance. At Battle of Midway, Japan lost not just ships, but the heart of its experienced carrier air arm. The loss was not immediately fatal, but it was permanent. From that point forward, every engagement favored the side that could replace losses faster than they occurred. Japan could not. Industrial limits closed in. Fuel shortages restricted training and operations. Aircraft designs improved too slowly to offset attrition. Pilots were rushed forward with inadequate preparation. Naval doctrine remained aggressive, but aggression without experience became increasingly costly. As the war expanded, another weakness emerged. Japan had built a navy for decisive battles, not prolonged campaigns. It expected one climactic engagement to determine the war at sea. Instead, it faced a grinding sequence of carrier strikes, submarine warfare, and amphibious operations that demanded constant presence and constant replacement. The U.S. Navy did not seek a single knockout blow. It dismantled Japanese naval power systematically. Submarines strangled logistics. Carrier task forces isolated islands. Air power erased surface fleets before they could engage. Even when Japanese ships survived, they sailed with reduced air cover, reduced fuel, and reduced hope of meaningful engagement. By the later stages of the war, carriers often served as decoys, their decks unable to contest the sky above them. Technology widened the gap. Radar gave early warning. Fighter direction controlled the air. Anti-aircraft coordination improved relentlessly. Japan struggled to match these developments at scale, and innovation existed, but not in numbers sufficient to change outcomes. By the time the war reached its final phase, Japanese naval superiority was not merely lost. It was gone. The oceans were no longer contested. Movements were no longer concealed. Decisions were no longer mutual. Naval power had shifted permanently to a force built on endurance rather than early dominance. Why Japan lost naval superiority is not a story of failure alone. It is a lesson that wars reward systems, not moments. That experience must be renewable. That dominance without sustainability is temporary by nature. Japan's Navy fought with brilliance, courage, and professionalism, but it fought a war that lasted longer than its structure could support. Tonight, we trace that decline, from early supremacy to irreversible imbalance. From elite dominance to attrition without recovery, from control of the Pacific to survival within it. This is the story of why Japan lost naval superiority in the Second World War. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and ask you directly. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it for you there? Is this a late night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just to sink into history? And if these long, calm journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or truly understand how power rises and falls over time, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is why Japan lost control of the sea. December 10th, 1941. The waters off the Malayan coast shimmer under a tropical sun. If aboard HMS Prince of Wales, lookouts scan empty skies while the battleship's massive 14-inch guns point uselessly at the horizon. Admiral Tom Phillips stands on the bridge, supremely confident in the doctrine that has governed naval warfare for centuries. Big guns on big ships rule the seas. In less than 2 hours, his ship and HMS Repulse will be at the bottom of the ocean, torn apart by aircraft he never believed could threaten a capital warship. As the first Japanese bombers appear as distant specks, Phillips refuses to believe what he's seeing. The age of the battleship is ending in real time, and he doesn't know it yet. The attack comes in waves, each more devastating than the last. Mitsubishi G-3M and G-4M bombers from the Imperial Japanese Navy's 22nd Air Flotilla drop from the clouds like hunting birds. They carry specially modified torpedoes designed for shallow water attacks, weapons the British assumed were impossible. The first torpedo slams into Prince of Wales's port side, destroying the propeller shaft and flooding the steering compartment. The ship begins listing almost immediately. More torpedoes follow in rapid succession. Admiral Phillips, a career officer who spent his life studying battleship tactics, watches his doctrine disintegrate around him. He goes down with his ship, along with over 840 men. Repulse suffers an even faster death, capsizing in just minutes after absorbing multiple torpedo hits. Survivors cling to wreckage in oil-slicked water, watching the supposedly unsinkable dreadnoughts vanish beneath the waves. In London, Winston Churchill will later write that he felt physically sick when he received the news. This is not an isolated incident. It's the beginning of a pattern that will define the Pacific War. For the next 6 months, the Imperial Japanese Navy operates as if it commands not just the ocean, but reality itself. Their carrier strike force, the Kido Butai, moves across the Pacific like a typhoon made of steel and aviation fuel. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's 6 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, carry over 350 aircraft, flown by the most experienced naval aviators on Earth. These pilots have trained for years, accumulating 700 hours of flight time before their first combat mission. They've honed their skills bombing Chinese cities and testing tactics that Western navies haven't even imagined yet. Their Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters achieve kill ratios of 12-1 in early engagements, dancing through the sky with a maneuverability that American pilots find almost supernatural. The Zero can turn inside any Allied fighter, its 20mm cannons shredding opponents before they even realize they're in danger. The technical superiority extends beyond aircraft. Japanese destroyers and cruisers carry the Type 93 torpedo, a weapon so advanced that American intelligence initially refuses to believe the reports. Allied sailors call it the Long Lance, though they don't know its official designation yet. This torpedo measures 24 inches in diameter and runs on pure oxygen, leaving almost no wake. It screams through the water at 49 knots for 11 kilometers, while the best American torpedoes struggle to reach 6 kilometers. When a Long Lance hits, it often breaks ships in half. The explosive warhead contains over 1,000 pounds of high explosives. In night battles around the Solomon Islands, Japanese cruisers will use these weapons to devastating effect, hitting targets they can barely see in the darkness. The technical gap is so profound that American sailors sometimes think they're being struck by submarine attacks when surface ships are actually killing them from impossible ranges. Tokyo's propaganda machine broadcasts these victories to the world, creating an aura of invincibility around the Imperial Navy. February 27th, 1942. The Battle of the Java Sea unfolds in the waters north of Surabaya. A combined force of American, British, Dutch, and Australian warships, the ABDA Command, attempts to stop a Japanese invasion convoy. Dutch Rear Admiral Karl Doorman commands 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers, a force that looks formidable on paper. But Japanese cruisers detect them first, opening fire with devastating accuracy. The battle rages for 7 hours as the afternoon fades into tropical night. Japanese long-lance torpedoes streak through the darkness like vengeful ghosts. HMS Exeter takes a direct hit that floods her boiler rooms. The Dutch cruisers De Ruyter and Java absorb torpedoes that detonate their magazines in spectacular explosions. Admiral Dorman goes down with his flagship, maintaining radio silence until the end so other ships might escape. They don't. Over the next 2 days, Japanese forces systematically hunt down and destroy the surviving ABDA ships. HMS Perth and USS Houston make a desperate run through Sunda Strait, only to blunder into another Japanese invasion force. They fight until their ammunition runs out, then fight some more, before the ocean claims them both. 2,000 men die in battles that feel less like combat and more like execution. The victories accumulate with mathematical precision. Wake Island falls after a heroic defense. Guam surrenders after barely a day. Hong Kong's garrison holds out for 17 days before starvation forces capitulation. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, falls in what Churchill calls the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. Over 80,000 Allied troops march into captivity. The Japanese forces have conquered an empire spanning from Burma to the Gilbert Islands in less than 6 months. They've sunk 5 Allied battleships, 1 carrier, 7 cruisers, and dozens of destroyers and submarines. Their own losses? Effectively 0 capital ships. In April 1942, Admiral Nagumo's carriers raid Ceylon, attacking Colombo and Trincomalee. They sink the British carrier HMS Hermes, along with multiple cruisers and destroyers. The British Eastern Fleet retreats all the way to East Africa, conceding the entire Indian Ocean. Churchill privately tells his advisors this is the most dangerous moment of the war, more dangerous than the fall of France, more dangerous than the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. But in a basement room in Hawaii, a different story is being written. Station Haipo, the U.S. Navy's Cryptanalysis Center at Pearl Harbor hums with activity even as wreckage still litters the harbor outside. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort works 20-hour days in a bathrobe, surrounded by punch cards and decryption tables. His team has partially broken the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, enough to glimpse fragments of their operational plans. What they're seeing doesn't match the image of Invincibility. Japanese messages contain urgent requests for replacement aircraft, complaints about maintenance backlogs, and references to pilot fatigue. One intercepted message mentions concerns about training standards declining due to operational tempo. Another discusses ammunition shortages that seem impossible for a nation supposedly swimming in resources. Admiral Chester Nimitz studies these decrypts with growing interest. The Japanese are winning every battle, but their messages read like those of a nation already struggling. Something doesn't add up. The illusion of invincibility rests on a foundation of sand. Japan began the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping, barely enough to supply their empire even in peacetime. Their industries consume resources they don't possess. Oil from the East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The entire strategic rationale for war assumes they can conquer these territories, fortify them, and somehow convince America to accept the new reality through a negotiated peace. But American intelligence estimates that Japan needs at least 3 million tons of operational shipping just to maintain supply lines. Submarines are already beginning to take their toll, picking off merchant vessels in the dark. Each tanker that goes down makes the next battle harder to fuel. Each transport sunk means troops starving on isolated islands. The mathematics are brutal and unforgiving. Japan is trading irreplaceable assets for temporary victories. They're winning battles while losing the war's fundamental arithmetic. The cultural mythology makes clear-eyed assessment nearly impossible. Bushido ideology permeates the officer corps, creating an atmosphere where questioning orders or expressing doubt becomes a form of cowardice. Junior officers who raise concerns about sustainability are silenced by superiors who invoke the samurai spirit. Planning documents for the southern operations, the conquest of Southeast Asia, contain almost no provisions for what happens after the initial victories. The assumption seems to be that Western powers will simply accept defeat once confronted with Japanese martial superiority. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, knows better. He spent years in America, studied at Harvard, served as a naval attaché in Washington. He understands American industrial capacity in a way most Japanese officers don't. Before the war, he told Prime Minister Konoe that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year. But after that, he had no expectation of success. His own superiors ignored this assessment. Now, 6 months into the war, Yamamoto watches his forces achieve victory after victory, while his private doubts multiply. He knows the Americans are building ships faster than Japan can sink them. He knows pilot training programs can't replace combat losses quickly enough. He knows that every day the war continues works against Japan. But the momentum of conquest has its own logic, and even Yamamoto cannot stop what he has started. May 1942 represents the high water mark, though almost nobody recognizes it at the time. The Kido Butai approaches Port Moresby, preparing to extend Japan's defensive perimeter even further. Occupation of Port Moresby would put northern Australia within range of Japanese bombers, potentially forcing Australia out of the war. The operation seems routine, another target, another inevitable victory. But American codebreakers have read Japan's mail. They know where the carriers are going, when they'll arrive, and what forces they're bringing. For the first time, the United States can position its own carriers to ambush the ambushers. The Battle of the Coral Sea is about to begin, and with it, the first cracks in the illusion of invincibility will appear. The Japanese don't know it yet, but they're about to learn that the Americans they've been defeating aren't the Americans they'll be fighting a year from now. The sleeping giant isn't just awake anymore, it's angry, it's learning, and it's building weapons in quantities that defy imagination. The next 6 months won't be like the last 6 months. Nothing will ever be the same again. January 1942. Deep inside a nondescript office building in Washington, Donald Nelson spreads production charts across a conference table, while President Franklin Roosevelt leans forward in his wheelchair. The numbers seem impossible, almost fantastical. And Nelson proposes building 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, doubling that in 1943. He wants to construct 8 million tons of shipping, enough to replace every merchant vessel lost, and then build an entirely new fleet on top of that. Roosevelt studies the figures with the same skepticism he might give a fairy tale. America has never attempted industrial mobilization on this scale. The entire auto industry would need to stop making cars and start making tanks. Shipyards would need to operate 24 hours a day. Factories that made washing machines would need to retool for making artillery shells. Nelson insists it's possible. Roosevelt approves the plan, but even he doesn't fully believe it can be done. Within 18 months, American industry will exceed every target Nelson set. The question isn't whether America can outproduce Japan. It's whether Japan can survive long enough to realize they never had a chance. Across the Pacific, Japanese procurement officers face a very different arithmetic. At Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' sprawling Nagasaki shipyard, workers labor on the hull of Musashi, sister ship to the mighty Yamato. The battleship is a marvel of engineering, destined to mount 9 18-inch guns and wear armor plate thick enough to stop any shell afloat. Construction began in 1938 and will take 4 years to complete, 4 years for one ship. Meanwhile, the Americans are talking about launching a Liberty ship every week. The Japanese managers don't believe these reports. They assume it's propaganda, misinformation designed to demoralize the home front. How could a nation of soft, materialistic individualists possibly outproduce the disciplined workers of the Imperial Japanese Empire? The cultural assumptions blind them to industrial reality. Japan's entire steel production for 1942 will total 7.8 million tons. America will produce 81.2 million tons in the same period, more than 10 times as much. This single statistic determines the war's outcome more surely than any battle. The disparities extend across every category of military production. Japan's aircraft industry, despite years of preparation, manages to build 8,861 planes in 1942. American factories produce 47,836 aircraft in the same year, more than 5 times Japan's output. By 1944, American production will reach 85,898 aircraft annually, while Japan's output actually declines due to bombing and resource shortages. The gap in carrier production is even more stark. Japan began the war with 10 carriers of various types and will commission 6 fleet carriers during the entire conflict. The United States will build 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 122 escort carriers, a total of 148 carriers in less than 4 years. Each Essex-class carrier displaces 36,000 tons fully loaded and can operate 90 aircraft. They are built in shipyards that didn't exist in 1941, using construction techniques that revolutionized naval architecture. Then Henry Kaiser's shipyards on the West Coast become industrial legends, launching vessels with an efficiency that seems almost superhuman. July 1942, Richmond, California. Workers at Kaiser Shipyard. Number 2 are attempting something unprecedented, building a Liberty ship in under 5 days. These cargo vessels, based on a simple British design, represent the antithesis of Japanese naval philosophy. Where Japan builds elegant warships with hand-fitted components, America builds ugly functional freighters using prefabricated sections welded together. The Liberty ship, Robert E. Peary, goes from keel laying to launch in 4 days, 15.5 hours, a world record that will never be broken. Newsreel cameras capture the moment as Champagne christens the bow and the vessel slides into San Francisco Bay. Workers cheer, but they're already moving to the next hull. Kaiser's yards will ultimately build over 1,400 Liberty ships, along with 50 escort carriers converted from merchant hulls. Each Liberty ship can carry 10,000 tons of cargo, tanks, trucks, food, ammunition, everything an army needs. Japan sinks them by the dozens. America builds them by the hundreds. The mathematics become a form of warfare all their own. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understands these numbers better than most of his colleagues. In July 1942, he tours the Kure Naval Arsenal, inspecting facilities and reviewing production schedules with the base commander. What he sees troubles him deeply. The yards are operating at maximum capacity, yet they can barely keep pace with routine maintenance, let alone combat damage. Maikikagi and Kaga need major refits that keep getting postponed, because there's no time and no spare parts. The new Taiho-class carrier won't be ready until 1944 at the earliest. Yamamoto does some mental arithmetic that fills him with dread. If Japan loses 2 or 3 carriers in a single engagement, it would take years to replace them, years Japan doesn't have. He shares these concerns with his chief of staff, Matome Ugaki, during a private conversation on the flagship Yamato. Ugaki tries to be reassuring, suggesting that Japanese quality will overcome American quantity. Yamamoto isn't convinced. He's seen American factories. He knows what's coming. But the momentum of war has its own logic, and even the combined fleet's commander cannot stop the machine he helped create. The oil situation adds another layer of mathematical doom. Japan's entire empire requires approximately 50 million barrels of petroleum annually to sustain military operations. Japanese-controlled oil fields in the Dutch East Indies and British Borneo can theoretically produce enough, but only if tankers can actually transport it to Japan's refineries. Each tanker sunk represents not just lost cargo, but lost future production, refined fuel that will never reach carriers, battleships, or aircraft. American submarines, though plagued by faulty torpedoes in the war's early years, are already beginning to take their toll. By 1943, submarine warfare will become systematic slaughter of Japanese merchant shipping. Japan begins the war with approximately 6 million tons of merchant vessels. They need at least 3 million tons operational at all times to maintain supply lines. By 1945, they'll have only 1.5 million tons left, and most of those will be trapped in ports by American air superiority. The noose tightens with mathematical inevitability. The financial arithmetic is equally devastating. Japan's entire military budget for 1942 amounts to approximately $5.6 billion, an enormous sum for their economy. stretching resources to the breaking point. The United States military budget for the same year exceeds $99 billion. A single B-29 Superfortress bomber costs $639,000 to produce, more than 10% of Japan's entire aircraft budget for one plane. America will build nearly 4,000 of them. The cost of maintaining the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet for 1 month roughly equals the cost of a single American Essex-class carrier, and America is building one every 2 months. These aren't just numbers in a ledger. They represent the industrial capacity to fight a war of attrition on a scale Japan's planners never imagined. Every ship, every plane, every tank destroyed can be replaced multiple times over. For Japan, every loss is potentially catastrophic. Cultural factors compound the mathematical disadvantages. Japanese military doctrine emphasizes quality over quantity, elite forces over mass armies, decisive battles over grinding attrition. This philosophy worked brilliantly in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. When Japan's fleet annihilated Russia's navy at Tsushima Strait through superior training and tactics. But America in 1942 isn't Russia in 1905. The United States doesn't need superior training or tactics, though they'll develop both eventually. They just need to keep building ships and planes faster than Japan can sink them, and they can do exactly that. Kaiser's shipyards operate 3 shifts around the clock. Aircraft factories in Southern California employ women who've never worked outside the home, training them to rivet bomber fuselages with assembly line efficiency. The American military-industrial complex isn't elegant or refined. It's brutal, overwhelming, and absolutely unstoppable once fully mobilized. December 1942 represents the inflection point, though few recognize it at the time. America has been at war for exactly 1 year. The production figures Nelson promised Roosevelt are not just being met, they're being exceeded. 62,000 aircraft roll off assembly lines, surpassing the target. Ship construction accelerates every month as workers become more efficient and new yards come online. The Essex-class carrier program launches its first vessel, with 16 more under construction. In the Solomon Islands, American and Japanese forces grind each other down in brutal battles around Guadalcanal. The Japanese think they're winning because they keep sinking American ships. They don't realize that every ship they sink is being replaced by 3 more under construction. The American pilots they shoot down are being replaced by graduates of training programs that produce combat-ready aviators in 6 months instead of 3 years. The mathematical reality is becoming operational reality, but Japan's leadership either doesn't see it or refuses to acknowledge it. The arithmetic of annihilation operates with mechanical precision. For every Japanese carrier destroyed, America can build 5. For every Japanese pilot killed, America trains 10 replacements. For every ton of Japanese shipping sunk, America launches 3 tons of new construction. These ratios aren't just statistics. They're death sentences delivered in steel and oil, aircraft aluminum, and high explosives. Japan's early victories bought them 6 months of dominance, just as Yamamoto predicted. But 6 months in total war is barely enough time to build a single fleet carrier using Japanese methods. America built 40 in the same period, counting all types. The war will continue for another 3.5 years, but the mathematical outcome is already determined. Japan is fighting against calculus itself, against equations that cannot be defeated by courage or skill or martial spirit. They're losing a war that arithmetic won before the first shot was fired. The only question now is how long it will take for the subtraction to finish its work. 1936. The Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima sits on a small island in Hiroshima Bay, its granite buildings reflecting centuries-old samurai traditions translated into naval form. Inside the tactical classroom, and instructors arrange miniature battleship models on a massive table representing the seas off the Japanese coast. Third-year cadets lean forward, absorbing the doctrine that has governed Japanese naval thinking since Admiral Heihachiro Togo's victory at Tsushima Strait in 1905. The scenario is always the same. Enemy battle line approaches, Japanese battleships execute crossing the T maneuver, gunnery superiority wins the day. Carriers appear in these exercises only as scouts, extending the visual range of the fleet's eyes. Their aircraft spot for battleship guns, nothing more. The instructors speak reverently of Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle that will crush Japan's enemies in a single overwhelming engagement. Every officer will spend his career preparing for this moment. The problem is that the moment they're preparing for belongs to a war that ended 30 years ago. The doctrine crystallizes into sacred text over the following years. By 1941, when Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, the Kantai Kessen concept has become religious dogma rather than tactical flexibility. The combined fleet's operational plans all envision a final showdown between battleship forces somewhere in the Western Pacific. American carriers will be lured into range, Japanese superior night fighting ability will devastate them, and then the battleships will finish whatever remains. The plan is elegant, mathematically precise, and completely disconnected from the reality of carrier warfare. Younger officers, those who have actually flown from carrier decks or studied American naval developments, sometimes raise concerns. They note that aircraft can strike at ranges where battleships are helpless. They point out that Pearl Harbor itself demonstrates carrier dominance. These objections are politely noted and systematically ignored. Senior admirals didn't spend 40 years mastering battleship tactics to abandon them for untested aviation theories. The institutional weight of tradition crushes innovation before it can flower. May 1942. Aboard the flagship Yamato, anchored in Japan's inland sea, Admiral Yamamoto conducts the final planning conference for the Midway operation. The plan is baroque in its complexity. Multiple force groups operating hundreds of miles apart. Diversionary attacks on the Aleutian Islands, carrier strikes coordinated with surface actions, all designed to force the Americans into the decisive battle Japan has been preparing for since Tsushima. Several younger staff officers raise questions about the dispersed forces. If American carriers appear unexpectedly, which group do they support? What if the Americans don't follow the script? Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most innovative aviators, suggests concentrating all carriers in a single overwhelming mass. His concerns are acknowledged with polite nods and then ignored. The senior admirals believe American carriers have been neutralized. Lexington sunk at Coral Sea, Yorktown damaged and withdrawing. The intelligence is wrong, but nobody questions it, because it fits the desired narrative. The plan proceeds as written, distributing Japanese strength across thousands of miles of ocean. When disaster strikes, if the dispersed forces will be too far apart to support each other, doctrine will have murdered reality. The pilot training system reflects the same rigid thinking. Japanese naval aviators undergo the most demanding program in the world, 400 to 700 flight hours before their first combat assignment, years of training and complex maneuvers, endless practice until every skill becomes instinctive. The result is a superbly trained elite force that performs brilliantly in the war's early battles. But elite forces have a fatal weakness. They're irreplaceable. When a Japanese pilot dies, he takes years of training investment with him. There's no rotation system, no program to pull experienced pilots back to train new students. The best pilots stay in combat until they're killed, or so badly wounded they can't fly. Nay, by October 1942, Japan has lost nearly half its experienced carrier pilots. The replacements receive abbreviated training because operational demands don't allow time for the old 400-hour program. Quality begins its inexorable decline. The doctrine that created an elite force contains no mechanism for sustaining it through attrition warfare. October the 26th, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz unfolds northeast of Guadalcanal as Japanese and American carrier forces maul each other in a day-long slugfest. Japanese pilots, still among the best in the world, put 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes into USS Hornet, ensuring its doom. They damage Enterprise and force South Dakota to withdraw. Admiral Kondo radios Tokyo claiming a great victory. 1 American carrier sunk, another damaged. For the loss of only 1 Japanese light carrier. The Naval General Staff celebrates. What the celebration doesn't acknowledge is that Japan lost 150 aircraft and roughly 100 pilots in the engagement. America lost 74 aircraft. The trade ratio seems favorable on paper until you factor in replacement rates. America is graduating 300 new pilots per month from training programs. Japan is producing perhaps 50. Every tactical victory that trades pilots one for one becomes a strategic defeat. But Kantai-Kessen Doctrine doesn't contemplate attrition. It envisions decisive battle followed by negotiated peace. The war continuing month after month, burning through irreplaceable personnel, isn't supposed to happen. The doctrine has no answer for reality's refusal to cooperate. The inflexibility extends beyond aviation into every aspect of naval operations. Japanese destroyers are designed primarily as surface combatants, built for high-speed torpedo attacks during the decisive battle. They carry devastating long-lance torpedoes, but limited anti-submarine weapons and almost no anti-aircraft capability. This design philosophy works brilliantly in the night surface actions around Guadalcanal, where Japanese destroyers savage American cruisers. But it leaves them vulnerable to submarines and aircraft, threats that prove far more important than surface gun duels. American destroyers, designed for versatile multi-mission operations, gradually overtake Japanese designs in effectiveness. Similarly, Japanese battleships prioritize massive guns and heavy armor for ship-to-ship combat, while neglecting anti-aircraft defenses. When air attack becomes the primary threat, these billion-yen behemoths become expensive targets rather than battle winners. The entire fleet architecture reflects assumptions about how naval war should be fought, assumptions that reality systematically destroys. March 1943. In a conference room at Naval General Staff Headquarters in Tokyo, younger officers present a radical proposal: abandon offensive operations, establish a defensive perimeter from the Marianas to Truk to Rabaul, force the Americans to attack across thousands of miles of ocean, while Japanese land-based aircraft and submarines bleed them dry. The plan has merit. It leverages Japan's interior lines. It uses land bases to offset carrier losses, and plays to strengths rather than weaknesses. The young commanders present their case with data: attrition rates, replacement calculations, fuel consumption analyses. The senior admirals listen politely, then reject the proposal almost immediately. Defensive operations violate the spirit of Kantai-Kessen. The combined fleet exists to attack, to seize initiative, to force the decisive battle on favorable terms. Retreating behind a defensive line feels like cowardice, even if tactically sound. Admiral Meinechi Koga, who replaced Yamamoto after his death, speaks for the old guard. Japan will continue offensive operations, will seek out the enemy, will win through superior fighting spirit. The young officers leave the meeting in silence, nay, already knowing they've lost not just the argument, but probably the war. The cultural roots of doctrinal rigidity run deep into Japanese military tradition. The Naval Officer Corps is 95% graduates of the Naval Academy at Itajima, creating a monoculture of thought that makes dissent almost impossible. Officers who graduated together, trained together, and advanced through the ranks together naturally think alike. The few officers with outside experience, like Yamamoto, who studied at Harvard and served in Washington, are exceptional precisely because they've seen alternative systems. But even Yamamoto cannot fully overcome institutional inertia. When he proposes new tactical approaches, he must frame them as extensions of traditional doctrine rather than departures from it. Younger officers with innovative ideas quickly learn to stay silent or risk career suicide. The system rewards conformity and punishes innovation. In peacetime, this creates an orderly, professional service. In war against an adaptable enemy, it creates institutional paralysis. The contrast with American naval evolution could not be starker. The U.S. Navy enters the war with its own rigid battleship-centric doctrine, but necessity forces rapid adaptation. After Pearl Harbor destroys the battle line, carriers become the fleet's backbone by default rather than design. Officers who prove effective get promoted regardless of seniority. Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser specialist, takes command of carriers at Midway and wins the Pacific War's most important battle. Admiral William Halsey, an aviator, commands surface forces with aggressive creativity. The Navy establishes doctrine evaluation boards that systematically review combat after-action reports and modify tactics based on what actually works rather than what's supposed to work. Pilot training expands exponentially, with experienced combat pilots rotated home to teach new students. None of this represents superior American wisdom. It's simply institutional flexibility born of desperation. Japan's early successes remove that desperation, allowing rigid doctrine to persist until it becomes a suicide pact. By 1944, the combined fleet operates under doctrines written for a war that no longer exists. The Kantai-Kessen concept still dominates operational planning, even though Japan no longer has enough carriers to execute it. Pilot training standards have collapsed, yet formations still call for complex maneuvers requiring elite skills. Surface forces continue planning for night torpedo attacks when radar has made darkness transparent to American forces. The doctrine remains unchanged because changing it would require admitting that everything the officer corps learned, everything they devoted their lives to mastering, has become obsolete. That admission is psychologically impossible for men who define themselves through adherence to tradition. So the plans grow more elaborate, the operations more complex, the gap between doctrine and reality more catastrophic. Japan will fight the rest of the war, trying to create conditions for a decisive battle that can never happen, sacrificing ships and men to chase a ghost from 1905. The doctrine has become a prison from which there is no escape except death. May 7th, 1942, 1100 hours. The Japanese light carrier Shoho steams south of the Louisiade archipelago, her flight deck crowded with aircraft preparing for patrol launches. Lookouts spot the first American planes at maximum visual range, small dots growing larger with terrifying speed. Within minutes, the sky fills with Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from USS Lexington and Yorktown. Shoho's captain orders evasive maneuvers, but a light carrier displaces only 11,000 tons. She's too small to absorb what's coming. Torpedoes slam into her port side in rapid succession. Bombs pierce her thin flight deck and explode in the hangar. Aviation fuel ignites, turning the interior into a furnace. Then, in less than 10 minutes, Shoho is mortally wounded. Lieutenant Commander Robert Dixon, circling overhead in his scout bomber, radios one of the war's most famous messages. "Scratch one flat top." The words crackle across American radio nets with the electric excitement. For the first time, carrier aircraft have sunk another carrier. The age of battleship dominance is officially over. Neither side fully understands yet what they've just witnessed. The Battle of the Coral Sea unfolds across 4 days in early May, as Japanese forces attempt to invade Port Moresby, while American carriers try to stop them. It's the first naval engagement in history where surface ships never sight each other. Everything happens through aircraft striking across hundreds of miles of empty ocean. Both sides operate partially blind, relying on scout planes and fragmentary radio reports. On May 8th, the main carrier groups finally find each other. Admiral Takeo Takagi's force includes fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, powerful vessels carrying over 100 aircraft between them. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commands Lexington and Yorktown, slightly smaller but carrying experienced American pilots who've trained for exactly this scenario. At 8:20 that morning, aircraft from both sides pass each other in midair, heading toward their respective targets. Pilots wave as they cross paths, knowing they're about to try killing each other's mothers. The battle becomes a race to see who can destroy the enemy carriers before their own are destroyed. Shokaku takes the first hit around 910 hours. American dive bombers from Yorktown roll into their attacks, pushing over into 70-degree dives that build airspeed past 300 knots. Anti-aircraft fire fills the sky with black puffs, but the Americans press through. 3 bombs strike Shokaku's forward flight deck in rapid succession. The first penetrates to the hangar deck and explodes among parked aircraft. The second detonates near the bow, starting fires that spread toward the aviation fuel tanks. The third hits farther aft, wrecking the deck and making aircraft operations impossible. Damage control parties fight flames with hand pumps, while the ship takes on water from near misses. Shokaku survives, but is out of the battle. streaming oil and listing. She'll require 2 months in dry dock. Yet this matters more than it seems. Shokaku and her sister Zuikaku will miss the Battle of Midway 1 month later because of damage and aircraft losses sustained here. That absence will prove decisive. Simultaneously, Japanese aircraft find the American carriers. Lexington, massive and slow, makes an obvious target. Type 97 Kate torpedo bombers attack from both sides in a coordinated pincer that no ship can avoid. 2 torpedoes slam into her port side, flooding 3 boiler rooms and causing a 7-degree list. Bombs strike her flight deck and penetrate to interior spaces. The ship seems under control initially, despite the damage. Fires are extinguished, the list corrected through counter-flooding. Captain Frederick Sherman believes his ship is saved. But Lexington's designers made a fatal error. They routed aviation fuel lines through passageways without adequate protection. At 1500 hours, gasoline vapors from ruptured lines find an ignition source. The resulting explosion blows a hole in the flight deck large enough to drive a truck through. More explosions follow as vapor accumulates in enclosed spaces. Men are killed by concussive force that leaves no visible wounds, their internal organs pulped by overpressure. By evening, Lexington is clearly doomed. Survivors abandon ship in good order, while destroyers stand by to rescue them. The carrier that sailors called Lady Lex slips beneath the waves that night, taking 35 aircraft with her. The night of May 8th brings disaster from an unexpected direction. Japanese scout planes, it's low on fuel and disoriented after searching for American carriers in fading light, attempt to return to their carriers. Navigation proves nearly impossible in the darkness. Several pilots mistake the American task force for their own, attempting to join the landing pattern for Yorktown. American gunners hold fire, confused by the sight of Japanese aircraft circling as if preparing to land. The moment of mutual recognition ends in chaos as both sides open fire. But the real tragedy plays out at the Japanese carriers, where air group commanders attempt to recover aircraft in pitch darkness. Japanese naval aviation has minimal night flying training. Carrier operations normally cease at sunset. Zuikaku's flight deck crew guides planes aboard using handlights and prayer. Aircraft crash into the ship's island, plow into the barriers, or miss the arresting wires and plunge over the bow. 21 planes are lost in landing accidents, more than combat destroyed. The pilots, irreplaceable veterans with years of training, die stupidly, unnecessarily, because Japanese doctrine never contemplated night carrier operations. The Americans, by contrast, routinely practice night operations. Their pilots land aboard Yorktown and Lexington in darkness, without loss. The technical and training gap reveals itself in ways neither side anticipated. The strategic calculus of Coral Sea seems ambiguous at first glance. Japan loses Shoho plus 77 aircraft. America loses Lexington and 66 aircraft. The exchange appears roughly even, perhaps even favoring Japan since they hold the invasion route. But the deeper mathematics tell a different story. Now, Japan lost 114 pilots at Coral Sea, including squadron leaders and veteran aviators. These men represent years of training investment that cannot be rapidly replaced. America lost 98 pilots, but American training programs are graduating 300 new pilots per month. The replacement rate differential means America can absorb these losses while Japan cannot. More critically, Shokaku's damage and Zuikaku's depleted air group remove both carriers from the order of battle for the next 2 months. Admiral Yamamoto is planning the Midway operation for early June, 1 month away. He's counting on having 6 carriers available. Now, he'll only have 4. That difference will determine the war's outcome. The Port Moresby invasion convoy, the entire strategic purpose of the operation, turns back on May 8th. Japanese admirals claim victory because they sank an American fleet carrier. American admirals claim victory because they stopped the invasion. Both are partially correct. The real significance lies in what Coral Sea reveals about the sustainability of losses. Japan achieved a tactical draw while suffering strategic defeat. They traded roughly even in ships and aircraft, but lost disproportionately more experienced pilots. They accomplished their immediate objectives, but failed their strategic goals. The mathematics of attrition warfare, the brutal calculus of replacement rates, begins asserting itself. Every battle that trades carriers 1-for-1, pilots 1-for-1, aircraft 1-for-1, moves Japan closer to catastrophe because America can replace its losses and Japan cannot. Commander Minoru Genda, one of Japan's most brilliant aviation tacticians, studies the after-action reports with growing unease. He calculates that Japan lost 43% of attack aircraft launched at Coral Sea. America lost 33%. Neither rate is sustainable for extended operations. But America doesn't need sustainability. They have replacement aircraft streaming from factories. Japan needs every plane, every pilot, to last as long as possible. The attrition rates at Coral Sea, if maintained, will destroy Japanese naval aviation within a year. Genda writes a detailed analysis recommending defensive operations, pilot rotation programs, and expanded training facilities. His report circulates through combined fleet headquarters, where senior admirals read it, nod thoughtfully, and continue planning offensive operations. The institutional momentum cannot be stopped. Japan will attack Midway in 1 month with 4 carriers instead of 6, with depleted air groups and tired pilots against an American force that now knows Japanese carriers can be hurt. The first crack has appeared in the edifice of Japanese naval supremacy. Within 30 days, that crack will become a chasm. The American pilots who fought at Coral Sea return to Pearl Harbor as heroes, but also as professors. They gather in briefing rooms to share hard-won lessons with replacement pilots. They talk about the Zero's incredible maneuverability, but also its vulnerability to diving attacks. They describe Japanese torpedo tactics, warning students about the coordinated anvil strikes that are almost impossible to evade. They emphasize that Japanese pilots are superb, professional, and extremely dangerous, not the nearsighted incompetence American propaganda portrays. This institutional learning, this systematic absorption and dissemination of combat experience, gives America a critical advantage. Japanese survivors of Coral Sea go back to their carriers without formal debriefing. Lessons learned die with pilots who don't survive. The same mistakes get repeated because there's no mechanism to prevent them. Admiral Fletcher's task force learned more from losing Lexington than Admiral Takagi's force learned from winning the tactical engagement. That difference, the ability to learn from failure, will matter more than any single weapon or tactic. The first crack has appeared, and now the Americans know exactly where to strike next. June 4th, 1942, 8:37 hours. The flight deck of carrier Akagi resembles organized chaos given physical form. Aviation ordnance crews swarm around parked aircraft, frantically switching weapons for the 3rd time this morning. Bombs designed for land targets are being removed and replaced with torpedoes meant for ships. Torpedoes are being disconnected and bombs reinstalled. Fuel lines snake across the deck between aircraft waiting for launch. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stands on the bridge, reading a radio message that has frozen him into indecision. A Japanese scout plane, running 2 hours late due to mechanical problems, has finally reported sighting American ships to the northeast. The message concludes with words that change everything. Appears to be accompanied by carrier. Nagumo's face shows no emotion, but his mind races through impossible calculations. He has aircraft armed for a second strike on Midway Island. Now he needs them armed for attacking carriers. The rearming process will take at least an hour. That hour will cost Japan the war. The path to this moment began 6 months earlier with the Pearl Harbor attack. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of that victory, knows the Americans won't accept defeat. He needs to force another decisive battle, destroy America's remaining carriers, and establish a defensive perimeter so strong that Washington will negotiate peace rather than face years of grinding warfare. Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral 1,100 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, becomes his target. Capture Midway and Japanese forces can threaten Hawaii itself. More importantly, American carriers will have to respond to defend it. Yamamoto crafts an elaborate plan involving feints toward the Aleutian Islands, a carrier strike on Midway, and a massive battleship force waiting to ambush whatever American carriers appear. The plan requires perfect coordination across thousands of miles. It assumes American carriers are crippled or cautious after Coral Sea. Every assumption is wrong. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort has spent 6 months breaking Japanese naval codes in the basement of Station Haipo at Pearl Harbor. His cryptanalysts can't read every message, but they can read enough. By late May, they've identified AF as the target for a major operation. They suspect AF means Midway, but can't prove it. Rochefort devises a brilliant deception. He orders Midway to send an uncoded message reporting their freshwater distillation system has broken down. 2 days later, Japanese radio intercepts mention that AF reports water shortage. Confirmation complete. Rochefort gives Admiral Chester Nimitz exact dates, times, and force compositions for the Japanese attack. Instead of being surprised, American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown repaired in 72 hours from coral sea damage that should have required months. Wait in ambush northeast of Midway. For once, the Americans know what's coming. They have time to prepare. Japan is sailing into a trap while thinking they're setting one. The morning attack on Midway Island launches at 0430 from Nagumo's 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. 108 aircraft pummel the atoll's defenses while protecting 108 more in reserve, armed with torpedoes in case American ships appear. The strike leader radios back recommending a second wave. Midway's airstrip remains operational. Nagumo faces his first decision: launch the reserve against Midway, or keep them ready for ships. He chooses Midway. Crews begin removing torpedoes and loading land bombs. Midway's desperate, obsolete defenders, Marine Corps pilots in antique Brewster Buffaloes, Army Air Force bombers with no fighter escort, attack the Japanese carriers in suicidal waves. They achieve nothing except buying time. Japanese Zero fighters cut them to pieces, but their sacrifice forces Nagumo to keep his combat air patrol overhead, burning fuel and ammunition. When the scout plane finally reports American carriers, Nagumo's strike force is disarmed, his flight deck cluttered with bombs and torpedoes scattered everywhere. He orders rearming for the 3rd time. The clock is ticking. 10:20 hours. The American strike has been underway since 0700, with torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters from all 3 carriers supposed to attack in coordinated waves. But navigation errors and timing problems have scattered the force. 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers from Hornet's torpedo squadron. 8 arrive alone, without fighter escort or dive bomber support. They attack anyway. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron leads his men in a low-level run against Kaga through a storm of anti-aircraft fire. Japanese Zero fighters swoop down like hunting hawks. One by one, the Devastators explode or crash into the ocean. All 15 are destroyed. Only one man, Ensign George Gay, survives, floating among the wreckage and watching what happens next. Torpedo 8 scores no hits. The same massacre repeats with torpedo squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown. 41 torpedo bombers attack. 35 are destroyed. Only 6 torpedoes even reach their targets, and all miss or malfunction. The sacrifice seems completely pointless. It's not. The Japanese fighter screen is drawn down to wave-top level, chasing torpedo bombers. Aircraft are crowded on the carrier decks, fully armed and fueled. Damage control crews are battling small fires from near misses. Nobody is watching the sky above. At 10:22 hours, dive bomber squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown roll into their attacks from 18,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey has been searching for the Japanese carriers for an extra 30 minutes after his calculated intercept point came up empty. Nay, he's almost ready to turn back when he spots a Japanese destroyer racing northeast at high speed. McCluskey follows the destroyer's wake. It leads him straight to Nagumo's carriers. He orders his squadrons to attack immediately, before the moment passes. 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers split into groups and push over into near-vertical dives. 10:24 hours. 4 minutes of violence that change history. The first bomb hits Akagi, just aft of the midships elevator. It penetrates to the hangar deck and explodes among fully armed aircraft. The blast ignites aviation fuel from the rearming operation. Secondary explosions rip through the ship as ordnance detonates in chain reactions. Akagi's flight deck becomes a sea of flame. Kaga takes 4 bombs in rapid succession. two near the island, two forward. Fires immediately rage out of control. Soryu absorbs 3 direct hits that turn her into an inferno within minutes. 3 fleet carriers, the heart of the Kido Butai that destroyed Pearl Harbor, become floating funeral pyres in less than 5 minutes. Admiral Nagumo stands on Akagi's bridge watching his flagship burn, paralyzed by the catastrophe. His staff physically drags him to a launch to evacuate. The Emperor's portrait is rescued from the flames. Everything else burns. Hiryu, operating separately from the other 3 carriers, survives the initial attack. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi immediately launches a counterstrike with every operational aircraft. His pilots are among Japan's best. They find Yorktown and hit her with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes. Yorktown survives initially, but takes on water and lists dangerously. As American dive bombers track Hiryu's aircraft back to their source. That afternoon, they catch Hiryu and plant 4 bombs into her. By evening, all 4 Japanese carriers are burning or sinking. Hiryu's captain Tomeo Kaku orders abandon ship after ensuring the Emperor's portrait is safe. He and Admiral Yamaguchi choose to go down with their vessel, singing the national anthem as fire consumes them. It's an honorable death by Japanese standards. It's also completely pointless. Far better commanders could have survived to lead future battles. But Bushido demands this final gesture. The strategic mathematics of Midway are brutally simple. Japan loses all 4 carriers, 248 aircraft, and 3,057 personnel, including 110 veteran pilots. America loses 1 carrier, Yorktown. It's scuttled after absorbing more damage than should be survivable. 1 destroyer, 145 aircraft, and 307 personnel. Japan's carrier striking power drops from 6 fleet carriers to 2 overnight, since Shokaku is still being repaired and Zuikaku needs a new air group. The disparity in pilot losses is even worse. Japan's training system produces perhaps 50 new carrier pilots per month. They just lost 110 of their best in a single day. The Americans lost experienced pilots too, but their training programs can replace them within weeks. Admiral Yamamoto, receiving the catastrophic reports aboard super battleship Yamato, briefly considers forcing a surface action. His massive battleship force outnumbers anything the Americans can deploy, but Midway's airstrip remains operational, and he has no air cover for his ships. He orders retreat. For the first time in the war, Japan has been defeated. The illusion of invincibility dies in the flames off Midway. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, exactly as Yamamoto predicted, Japan's ability to run wild comes to an end. The long, grinding, mathematically inevitable defeat begins now. August 9th, 1942, 2 hours past midnight. The waters north of Savo Island are black as ink under overcast skies. Sailors aboard the American cruisers USS Astoria, Quincy, and Vincennes stand watch in the darkness, exhausted after 2 days of supporting the Marine landing on Guadalcanal. They don't know that 7 Japanese cruisers and 1 destroyer are approaching at 30 knots. Their crews trained specifically for night combat. Their ships carrying the deadly long-lance torpedoes. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa has drilled his force to perfection. They've operated under radio silence, approaching undetected through a rain squall. At 0138 hours, Japanese lookouts spot the American screening force. Mikawa's ships launch 45 torpedoes in a devastating spread, then open fire with their main batteries. The Battle of Savo Island becomes a massacre. Astoria, Quincy, Vincennes, and the Australian cruiser HMAS Canberra are turned into blazing wrecks within 32 minutes. 1,077 American and Australian sailors die in the worst open ocean defeat in U.S. Navy history. Mikawa withdraws at dawn, inexplicably declining to attack the vulnerable American transports off Guadalcanal. Had he pressed the attack, then he could have destroyed the entire invasion. Instead, he settles for a tactical victory that changes nothing strategically. It's a pattern that will repeat throughout the campaign. The Guadalcanal campaign becomes an unexpected meat grinder because neither side can afford to lose. For Japan, the island represents the southernmost point of their defensive perimeter. If it falls, Australia and New Zealand remain in the war, and Allied forces gain a staging base for rolling back Japanese conquests. For America, Guadalcanal is the first offensive operation of the war. Losing would devastate morale and potentially extend the Pacific War by years, so both navies pour resources into a small island in the Solomon chain that most people had never heard of. Between August 1942 and February 1943, again 7 major surface actions and countless smaller engagements turned the waters around Guadalcanal into a graveyard. The strait between Guadalcanal and Florida Island becomes so littered with wreckage that sailors call it Iron Bottom Sound. At night, Japanese destroyers run supplies and reinforcements down from Rabaul in operations the Allies call the Tokyo Express, and the Japanese call the Rat Run. By day, American aircraft from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and from carriers offshore pound Japanese shipping. It's brutal, grinding warfare with no elegant solutions. October the 26th, 1942. The Battle of Santa Cruz unfolds northeast of Guadalcanal as Japanese and American carrier forces clash for the third time in 5 months. Admiral Nagumo, now commanding the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku plus the light carrier Zuiho, launches coordinated strikes against USS Enterprise and Hornet. Japanese pilots, still among the world's best despite Midway losses, press home their attacks with professional precision. They put 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes into Hornet, ensuring the carrier's death. Enterprise takes multiple bomb hits but survives thanks to superior damage control. American pilots damage Shokaku badly enough to require months of repairs and land bombs on Zuiho's flight deck. By any tactical measure, Japan wins. They sink a fleet carrier and damage another for the loss of only 1 light carrier damaged. Admiral Kondo radios Tokyo, claiming a great victory. The Naval General Staff celebrates. What the celebrations don't acknowledge is the cost in pilots. Japan loses 98 carrier aircraft and roughly 100 pilots at Santa Cruz. America loses 74 aircraft. The mathematics of attrition assert themselves again. Japan can build aircraft, but cannot replace elite pilots at rates that sustain their losses. Every tactical victory that trades pilots 1 for 1 becomes a strategic defeat. November the 13th, 1942. Friday the 13th proves unlucky for both sides. A Japanese convoy carrying troops and supplies to Guadalcanal approaches in darkness, escorted by battleships Hiei and Kirishima. American Rear Admiral Daniel Callahan leads a hodgepodge force of cruisers and destroyers to intercept. Neither force has radar that works properly. The engagement begins at point-blank range, sometimes less than 3,000 yards, in pitch darkness. Ships fire at muzzle flashes. Torpedoes crisscross the strait. USS Atlanta takes friendly fire from USS San Francisco, while Japanese shells tear apart her superstructure. Haitei and San Francisco pound each other until both bridges are wrecked, and most senior officers dead. Admiral Callahan dies at his post, killed by a shell that decapitates him. The destroyer USS Laffey literally scrapes alongside Shiei, firing into the battleship's superstructure from meters away before Japanese guns blow the destroyer apart. When dawn breaks, the strait is covered in oil, debris, and bodies. Hiei, damaged and dead in the water, is scuttled after American aircraft finish her. The Japanese convoy turns back. The Americans have traded heavily. 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk, but they've prevented reinforcements from reaching Guadalcanal. Yes, this defines the campaign. Tactical draws that Japan can't afford because they need victories to win, while America only needs to avoid losing to eventually prevail. The Tokyo Express runs continue through the fall and winter. Japanese destroyers racing down the slot between the Solomon Islands at high speed, dropping off supplies and troops, then racing back before dawn brings American aircraft. It's dangerous, exhausting work. The destroyers excel at surface combat but carry limited cargo space. A typical Tokyo Express run delivers only 200 to 300 tons of supplies when the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal needs several thousand tons weekly just to survive. 30% of supplies get delivered. The rest are lost overboard during high-speed maneuvers or when American aircraft attack. And Japan is using billion-yen destroyers as cargo vessels while their crews die of exhaustion and their hulls wear out from constant operations. It's strategically insane, but tactically necessary, because American air superiority makes conventional convoy operations suicidal. The destroyers themselves start dying. Between October and December, Japan loses 11 destroyers at or around Guadalcanal. Each represents 2 years of construction and irreplaceable crews. America loses 14 destroyers in the same period, but has 75 under construction. The mathematics continue their brutal work. The naval losses mount with mechanical inevitability. By February 1943, Japan has lost 2 battleships, 1 fleet carrier, 4 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 11 destroyers around Guadalcanal. They have also lost approximately 650 aircraft and their pilots. America has lost 2 fleet carriers, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 14 destroyers, plus about 420 aircraft. The exchange appears roughly even, perhaps even favoring America, but these numbers conceal the crucial difference. America can replace its losses within months. Japan cannot. Japanese shipyards are already operating at maximum capacity. Every hull lost represents a gap in the fleet that won't be filled for years. American shipyards are still ramping up. Essex-class carriers are sliding down the ways at 2-month intervals. Destroyer production has become an assembly line operation. By late 1943, that American industry will be building destroyers faster than Japan can sink them, even if they win every battle. February 1st through 7th, 1943. Operation Key unfolds as Japan evacuates Guadalcanal in a series of nighttime destroyer runs. The Tokyo Express reverses direction, pulling out surviving troops rather than delivering supplies. Over 6 nights, 20 destroyers extract 10,952 men from the island, mostly starving and sick. It's a brilliantly executed operation that saves thousands of lives. It's also an admission of defeat. Japan held Guadalcanal for 6 months, lost over 20,000 men to combat and disease, sacrificed dozens of ships and hundreds of aircraft, and achieved nothing except delaying the inevitable. The American position grows stronger every day. Henderson Field now hosts over 100 aircraft. Supply lines to Australia and New Zealand are secure. The road to Rabaul, and eventually to Tokyo, is open. Japanese admirals in Tokyo can claim they conducted an orderly withdrawal rather than a chaotic defeat. The troops evacuated from Guadalcanal know the truth. They were starved, beaten, and abandoned, surviving on grass and tree bark while their own supply lines collapsed. The Guadalcanal campaign's strategic impact extends far beyond the island itself. Japan committed significant portions of their combined fleet to a secondary objective and suffered irreplaceable losses in a grinding attrition battle they couldn't win. The night surface actions that Japan dominated tactically couldn't overcome American material advantages and weren't sustainable strategically. Most critically, the campaign destroyed what remained of Japan's elite pilot force. The training system that produced the Pearl Harbor Strike Force is broken. New pilots receive abbreviated instruction because there's no time for the old 700-hour program. Combat losses exceed replacement rates every single month. Quality declines inexorably. By early 1943, Japanese pilots are still good. Some are still excellent, but they're no longer uniformly elite. The Americans, meanwhile, have implemented a pilot rotation system. Combat veterans return to train new pilots, transferring lessons learned to students. The institutional knowledge doesn't die with individual pilots. This seemingly mundane administrative detail matters more than any secret weapon. Japan's aircraft production continues. Their carriers eventually return to service. But they can never replace the Guadalcanal generation of pilots. The graveyard claimed more than ships and men. It claimed the expertise that made Japanese naval aviation formidable. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, who commanded many of the Tokyo Express runs, writes after the war that Guadalcanal represented the moment Japan lost the initiative permanently. The combined fleet could still win tactical victories, but strategic success became impossible because America's industrial production made every exchange rate favor their side. Japanese sailors fought with incredible courage, often outmatching American forces tactically. But courage cannot manufacture fuel oil, cannot build destroyers faster than they're sunk, cannot replace pilots at rates that maintain quality. The mathematical reality of industrial warfare reasserts itself with each engagement. Guadalcanal isn't the war's turning point. That was Midway. But it's the campaign where the turning point becomes irreversible. Japan can no longer attack effectively. From February 1943 forward, every operation is defensive, reactive, desperately trying to slow an enemy who grows stronger by the day. The graveyard of Iron Bottom Sound contains more than physical wreckage. It holds the corpse of Japanese strategic flexibility, drowned in 6 months of battles that tactical skill couldn't win. November 1943. The frigid waters of La Perouse Strait, between Japan's northernmost island and Soviet Sakhalin, churn with autumn storms. USS Wahoo surfaces in darkness, her conning tower barely visible in the heavy seas. Where Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton studies the strait through his periscope, counting cargo ships silhouetted against the distant shore. In a single patrol, he's already sunk 4 Maru, Japanese merchant vessels, sending thousands of tons of cargo to the bottom. These aren't combat actions that will make newspaper headlines. There are no dramatic carrier duels or surface gun battles, just patient stalking followed by torpedo explosions and ships dying slowly in the cold northern waters. This is the 4th of 7 patrols Morton will command on Wahoo. The submarine and her crew will never return from the 7th. Japanese aircraft will catch them transiting the strait on October 11, 1943, sending Wahoo and all 80 men to the bottom. But by then, Morton will have sunk 20 confirmed vessels totaling 60,000 tons. Multiply his story by 288 submarines, and you have the campaign that strangled Japan more effectively than any fleet action. The American submarine campaign begins badly, almost farcically. The Mark 14 torpedo, standard armament for U.S. submarines, suffers from multiple critical defects that weren't discovered in peacetime testing. The magnetic exploder triggers prematurely, or not at all. The contact exploder fails at steep angles, actually bouncing off target hulls without detonating. The torpedoes run 10 feet deeper than set, passing underneath targets. Submarine commanders report these problems after returning from patrols where they fired 20 torpedoes and achieved 0 sinks. The Bureau of Ordnance in Washington refuses to believe them, insisting the torpedoes work perfectly and blaming crew error. It takes until September 1943, nearly 2 years into the war, before the problems are fully acknowledged and fixed. Thousands of tons of Japanese shipping survived this period simply because American torpedoes won't explode. Once the defects are corrected, the slaughter begins in earnest. January 1944. Japanese convoy HI-81 steams northeast from Singapore toward Japan, carrying crude oil desperately needed for the combined fleet. 3 heavily laden tankers wallow through the South China Sea, protected by escorts that scan for submarines. In the Luzon Strait, north of the Philippines, USS Poggi and USS Paddle wait at periscope depth. They've been alerted to the convoy's route by codebreakers reading Japanese radio traffic. The submarines coordinate their attack via radio in a tactic called Wolfpack, borrowed from successful German U-boat operations in the Atlantic. At dawn on January 12th, both submarines fire spreads of torpedoes from different angles. The tankers have no chance. 3 ships totaling 65,000 tons of capacity explode and sink within minutes. The crude oil they carried, thousands of barrels destined for Japanese refineries, spreads across the ocean surface in rainbow slicks. On Rabaul, Japanese troops are already eating reduced rations because supply convoys keep getting sunk. This oil loss means the combined fleet's fuel reserves drop another notch toward empty. Every tanker sunk cascades through Japan's entire war machine. Oil doesn't reach refineries, so fuel doesn't reach air bases, so aircraft can't fly missions, so American forces advance more easily. The strategic target selection distinguishes American submarine warfare from Japan's. Japanese submarines, adhering to traditional doctrine, hunt primarily for enemy warships, carriers, battleships, cruisers. They want decisive combat victories, not grinding attrition. This philosophy nets them some spectacular successes. USS Yorktown, already damaged at Midway, is finished off by submarine Invincibility 168. USS Wasp falls to I-19's torpedo spread. But these are exceptions. Most Japanese submarine patrols return without sinking major targets. They pass merchant ships without attacking, considering them beneath notice. American submarines, by contrast, are unleashed against anything that floats. Tankers, cargo vessels, troop transports, coastal freighters, all are legitimate targets. The strategy aims at economic strangulation rather than tactical victory. By 1944, American submarines are sinking Japanese merchant tonnage faster than Japanese shipyards can replace it. The mathematics become inexorable. Japan begins the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping and needs minimum 3 million tons operational to maintain supply lines. By 1945, only 1.5 million tons remain, much of it trapped in harbors by American air superiority. June 1944. Japanese submarine. Our 52 attempts a supply run to German-occupied France, a desperate mission to exchange strategic materials between Axis powers. The submarine carries 2 tons of gold to pay for German technology, plus 228 tons of tungsten, molybdenum, and other materials Germany needs for weapons production. I-52 surfaces in the mid-Atlantic to rendezvous with a German U-boat that will guide them through the Bay of Biscay. The Americans have read the Japanese radio traffic arranging this meeting. Carrier USS Bogue launches anti-submarine aircraft that locate I-52 through radar. Acoustic homing torpedoes send the submarine to the bottom with all hands and its precious cargo. This exemplifies the futility of Japanese submarine operations by 1944. They're reduced to running errands between Axis powers while American submarines systematically destroy their merchant fleet. The gold sits on the ocean floor at 15,000 feet depth, a literal and metaphorical waste of resources Japan can't afford. The human cost of submarine warfare rarely appears in statistics, but it's staggering. American submariners face the highest casualty rate of any U.S. military service. 52 submarines lost, 3,705 men killed, roughly 16% of personnel who served in the silent service. It's dangerous, claustrophobic work in vessels that become tombs if something goes wrong. But Japanese merchant mariners suffer far worse. Over 2,100 Japanese merchant ships are sunk during the war. Estimates suggest 60,000 merchant seamen died, many of them slowly from thirst and exposure in lifeboats. Japanese planners never established an effective convoy system until 1943, and even then, it's inadequate. That merchant ships often sail alone or with minimal escort, because Japanese destroyers are needed for combat operations. This is strategic madness. The merchant fleet is Japan's lifeline, and they treat it as expendable. By 1944, Japanese merchant crews are being drafted from civilian life with minimal training because experienced sailors keep dying. Ships sail with partially trained crews who don't know proper damage control or abandon ship procedures. When torpedoes hit, survival rates plummet. October 1944. The Japanese Inland Sea, Japan's most protected waterway, has become unsafe for naval operations due to American submarine penetration. Fuel situation reaches crisis levels. As the combined fleet possesses approximately 630,000 kiloliters of oil, enough for 3 months of defensive operations, or 1 major offensive. Admiral Toyota makes a fateful decision: sortie the entire fleet to the Philippines for one final battle, or watch it die slowly in port from fuel starvation. The American submarine blockade has achieved what no battle could. It's forced Japan to risk everything on a single desperate gamble because there's no fuel for anything else. The submarines don't accomplish this through spectacular single-ship kills. They do it through patient, methodical destruction of tankers and cargo vessels, 1 torpedo spread at a time, month after month, until Japan's industrial economy collapses. It's the opposite of the decisive battle Japan obsessed over. It's slow, grinding, and completely effective strangulation. The final tally of American submarine warfare is staggering. U.S. submarines sink 1,314 Japanese ships, totaling 5.3 million tons, 55% of all Japanese merchant losses during the war. They also sink 1 battleship, 8 carriers, mostly escorts, 11 cruisers, and over 200 other military vessels. Japanese submarines, by comparison, sink 184 merchant ships, but only 2 major U.S. warships after Midway. The strategic priorities are perfectly inverted. America attacks the enemy's economy and industrial capacity, while also sinking warships opportunistically. Japan attacks warships while ignoring the merchant fleet that could interdict American supply lines. This difference in doctrine reflects deeper strategic understanding. America recognizes they're fighting an industrial war where economic capacity determines victory. Japan still thinks they're fighting the Russo-Japanese War, where elite forces achieve decisive tactical victories that force peace negotiations. The submarine campaign exposes this delusion. You can't negotiate peace with a nation whose submarines are sinking your ships faster than you can build them, whose industrial production increases every month, whose technological advantage grows with each passing year. By war's end, Japan's merchant marine has been virtually annihilated. The once great Zaibatsu shipping companies, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, Nippon Yusen, operate tiny remnant fleets. Millions of tons of supplies sit in warehouses across Southeast Asia. Ain't unable to reach Japan because there are no ships to carry them. Troops starve on Pacific Islands, not because supplies don't exist, but because submarines have made their delivery impossible. The home islands face starvation not because of crop failures, but because rice from Korea and Indochina can't get through the submarine blockade. The silent service accomplished what battleships and carriers could not. They defeated Japan by attacking the unglamorous but essential foundations of industrial warfare. Commander Morton and thousands of submariners like him never received the recognition of Halsey or Spruance. They didn't sink enemy carriers in spectacular battles filmed for newsreels. They just went out month after month, hunting in darkness, sending tankers and cargo ships to the bottom until nothing was left to sink. It was brutal, as methodical, and absolutely decisive. June 19th, 1944. 1,000 hours. The radar screens aboard American carriers flicker with approaching contacts, hundreds of them, like a swarm of metal locusts crossing the Philippine Sea. This is Raid 1. 69 Japanese aircraft from carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, heading toward Task Force 58 with the confidence of pilots who believe their enemies are the same soft Americans they defeated 3 years ago. They're wrong. Lieutenant Commander Paul Buey, fighter director officer aboard USS Lexington, watches the radar plots develop from over 150 miles away. His voice crackles calmly across radio circuits as he vectors 8 fighter divisions toward the intercept. 45 Grumman F-6F. Hellcat fighters climb to altitude. They're pilots fresh from training programs that have transformed American naval aviation. The Japanese don't know it yet, but they're flying into a massacre so one-sided that American pilots will joke about it for decades. Lieutenant Alex Vresiu, already an ace with 12 kills, will shoot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes during this battle. When he lands back on Intrepid, he'll hold up 6 fingers for the flight deck crew and exclaim, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The phrase enters history immediately. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, Operation Eigo for the Japanese, represents Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's attempt to destroy American carrier forces, threatening the Marianas. On paper, his plan seems sound. He commands 9 carriers with approximately 473 aircraft. It's supported by land-based aircraft from Guam, Tinian, and other island bases. American Task Force 58 has 15 carriers with approximately 900 aircraft. But Ozawa believes his advantages in aircraft range and land-based support offset this disparity. More critically, he doesn't understand how catastrophically Japanese pilot quality has declined. The men flying from his carriers received perhaps 3 months training and 100 to 150 flight hours, barely enough to land on a carrier without crashing, let alone fight experienced American pilots. Many have never dropped a live bomb or fired at a moving target. Some have never landed on a carrier deck before today. The elite generation that struck Pearl Harbor is dead. These replacements are sacrificial lambs pretending to be wolves. The contrast in pilot quality becomes apparent within minutes of first contact. American pilots have spent months in training, then more months in fleet operations. They've practiced gunnery until their shooting becomes instinctive. Their tactics manuals are rewritten continuously based on combat lessons. They fly the F-6F Hellcat, a fighter specifically designed to kill Zeros through superior speed and diving ability rather than trying to outturn them. The Hellcat isn't elegant. It's a brutish heavy machine that sacrifices maneuverability for armor, firepower, and pilot protection. But it works. The 650 caliber machine guns can shred Japanese aircraft, which still use minimal armor to save weight. When the forces meet, the slaughter exceeds even American expectations. Japanese formations lose cohesion immediately under fighter attack. Rookie pilots panic, breaking formation and becoming easy targets. Bombers attempting to attack the carriers can't penetrate the combat air patrol. Those that do get through face murderous anti-aircraft fire from escorts equipped with proximity-fused shells, another American technological advantage. By end of Raid 1, 42 of 69 Japanese aircraft are destroyed. 0 reach the carriers. 1,300 hours. While aerial combat rages, submarine USS Albacore fires a spread of torpedoes at carrier Taiho, the newest and most modern vessel in the Japanese fleet. One torpedo hits the forward starboard side, flooding an aviation fuel tank. Initially, the damage seems manageable. Taiho maintains speed and continues operations. But design flaws and poor damage control doom her. Ruptured fuel lines leak aviation gasoline into closed spaces throughout the ship. A damage control officer, trying to clear fumes, opens ventilation systems that spread vapor throughout the vessel instead of venting it overboard. For 6 hours, Taiho operates normally while becoming a floating bomb. At 15:32 hours, an electric spark finds the vapor. The explosion blows the armored flight deck straight up into the air, ripping the ship open from inside. Secondary explosions follow as fuel and ordnance detonate throughout the hull. Taiho, pride of the combined fleet, settles by the bow and sinks, taking 1,650 crew with her. A single torpedo shouldn't have killed such a heavily built ship. In poor damage control and design compromises transform survivable damage into catastrophe, the exact opposite of American carrier design philosophy. The raids continue throughout the day in waves that grow progressively more ineffective. Raid 2 loses 70 aircraft of 109 launched. Raid 3 loses 7 of 47. Raid 4 loses 73 of 82. The Americans watch radar scopes in amazement as Japanese formations approach, get decimated, and the survivors flee in disorder. American losses total 23 aircraft in air combat. Carrier Bunker Hill takes 1 bomb hit that causes minor damage. That's the extent of Japanese success. By evening, Admiral Ozawa has lost over 300 aircraft and 2 fleet carriers, Taiho and Shokaku. The latter sunk by submarine USS Kavala with 3 torpedoes that trigger massive internal explosions. The Japanese call it a battle. The Americans call it practice. The turkey shoot description, though disrespectful to the courage of Japanese pilots who died trying their best, captures the lopsided nature of the slaughter. This isn't combat between equals. It's target practice against pilots so poorly trained they can't even properly bail out when their aircraft are hit. The night of June 19th presents American commanders with a dilemma. Admiral Spruance, commanding Task Force 58, knows roughly where the Japanese fleet is retreating, but not exactly. A strike launched now would have to return in darkness, risking heavy losses to navigation and landing accidents. Spruance chooses caution, waiting for dawn. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding the carriers directly, argues for an immediate strike. Late on June 20th, scout planes finally locate the Japanese fleet at extreme range, 275 miles west. Mitcher makes the call, launch everything. 216 aircraft take off at 1600 hours, knowing they'll have to return and land in pitch darkness. Fuel will be critical. Some won't make it back. The strike finds Japanese carriers at the edge of dusk, golden sunlight fading into tropical night. The attack sinks carrier Hiyo and 2 oilers while damaging multiple other ships. Japanese combat air patrol, still struggling with poorly trained pilots, barely interferes. But the return journey becomes its own nightmare. American pilots fly back in darkness, with fuel gauges dropping toward empty. Aboard Task Force 58 ships light up like cities to guide them home. A massive risk in submarine-infested waters, but even with navigation help, pilots struggle to find carriers in the darkness. Aircraft ditch in the ocean when their fuel runs out. Others crash attempting night landings. 80 American aircraft are lost on the return, though destroyers rescue most of the aircrew. The losses are painful but sustainable. America has replacement aircraft already en route from Hawaii, and all the pilots will fly again after brief rest. Japan has lost 3 fleet carriers, over 470 aircraft, and roughly 445 pilots. These losses are irreplaceable. The aftermath of Philippine Sea reveals the full extent of Japan's training system collapse. Any captured documents and interrogated pilots provide American intelligence with sobering data. New Japanese pilots in June 1944 average 120 flight hours before combat assignment, compared to over 300 for American pilots and 700 for the Pearl Harbor generation. The shortened training stems from multiple causes: fuel shortages limiting flight time, instructor shortages because combat veterans never get rotated home to teach, and desperation to replace mounting losses. Quality declines catastrophically. These pilots can barely take off and land, let alone dogfight. Their navigation is poor, their gunnery worse. They don't understand tactical formations or how to coordinate attacks. Throwing them against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft is effectively murder. But Japan has no alternative. The elite pilot force is dead, and there's no time to rebuild it properly. So they keep sending graduates to carriers after 3 months training, hoping quantity can substitute for quality. The turkey shoot demonstrates how completely this fails. Admiral Ozawa, surveying the wreckage of his force, radios Tokyo requesting withdrawal to reorganize. Permission is granted immediately. The combined fleet's carrier force has been annihilated as an effective fighting tool. Carriers still float, but without trained aircrew, they're just expensive transport vessels. Japan will use carriers as decoys 4 months later at Leyte Gulf, precisely because they can no longer operate them as fighting ships. The Philippine Sea battle isn't quite the decisive engagement Japanese doctrine always envisioned, but it might as well be. After June 20th, 1944, Japan cannot conduct offensive carrier operations. They can't even conduct defensive carrier operations effectively. What remains of their naval aviation will be absorbed into land-based air forces or, eventually, kamikaze units. The concept of carriers as mobile airfields controlling vast stretches of ocean, the concept Japan pioneered at Pearl Harbor, dies here. American carriers now dominate the Pacific without serious challenge. The turkey shoot wasn't just a lopsided victory, it was the final proof that Japan's entire naval aviation system had collapsed beyond salvage. The Americans didn't just win a battle, they eliminated Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic factor. From June 1944 forward, the Pacific War's outcome isn't in doubt. Only the duration remains uncertain. March 1944. A conference room in Tokyo Combined Fleet Headquarters. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, recently appointed commander of Japan's naval forces, spreads fuel consumption reports across a lacquered table. The numbers tell a story of mathematical doom. At current operational rates, Japan has approximately 6 months of petroleum reserves remaining. 6 months before the combined fleet becomes a museum display, rusting in harbors because there's no fuel to move it. Toyota's staff officers maintain carefully neutral expressions while studying these figures. Everyone understands what they mean, but nobody wants to say it aloud. Japan conquered the Dutch East Indies, specifically to secure oil fields. Those fields still produce crude. Balikpapan, Tarakan, Palembang continue pumping millions of barrels. But American submarines sink the tankers before they can reach Japanese refineries. The oil sits uselessly in storage tanks across Southeast Asia, while warships in Japan's inland sea ration fuel like misers hoarding gold. Toyota makes a decision that will define the rest of the war: concentrate the fleet near fuel sources rather than waste precious petroleum transporting fuel to Japan. It's an admission that geography has defeated strategy. The combined fleet will spend the next 6 months trapped in Singapore's anchorages, next to oil they can't efficiently use, because moving ships is more practical than moving fuel. The oil crisis didn't emerge suddenly. It's been building since American submarines started systematically targeting tankers in 1942. But by 1944, the cumulative effect has become catastrophic. Japan imported approximately 40 million barrels of petroleum annually before the war, mostly from the United States, a dependency that contributed to the decision to fight in the first place. Japanese planners assumed they could replace American imports with production from conquered territories. The assumption was half right. The oil fields produce enough crude, but the refineries, tankers, and distribution systems can't deliver it to where it's needed. Refineries in the Dutch East Indies lack the capacity to process all the crude being pumped. Tankers get sunk faster than shipyards can build them. Each tanker lost creates a cascading effect. Less oil reaches Japan, less fuel reaches air bases, pilot training hours get cut, pilot quality declines, losses increase, more tankers get sunk because fighter cover diminishes. It's a death spiral with no escape. The fuel shortage cascades through every aspect of military operations. The most visible impact hits pilot training. New aviators who should receive 400 hours of flight training before combat assignment now receive 100 hours. Barely enough to solo, let alone fight. Advanced maneuvers, formation, flying, and gunnery practice get minimized to save fuel. Combat units stop practicing because every gallon of aviation fuel must be hoarded for actual operations. Naval officers observe with growing horror as pilot quality degrades monthly. By mid-1944, the average Japanese naval aviator has less flight time than the crop dusters back in Kansas. They can take off, fly straight, and land sometimes. Everything else is learned in combat, if they survive long enough to learn anything. The zero-sum choice between training and operations guarantees operational failure because undertrained pilots die faster, requiring more replacements, creating more demand for training that can't be provided because there's no fuel. The mathematics become self-executing doom. August 1944. Linga Roads near Singapore. The combined fleet bobs at anchor in tropical heat. Hulls fouled with marine growth. Crews going soft from inactivity. Battleship Yamato's massive guns haven't fired in months. Carriers Zuikaku, Junyo, and others sit with reduced air groups because there's no fuel for flight operations. Shore leave gets restricted because local authorities fear bored sailors causing trouble. This is the world's second largest navy, and theoretically capable of projecting power across oceans, reduced to prison camp existence because moving ships burns fuel they can't spare. American submarines patrol outside the anchorage like wolves watching a corral. Every time a Japanese ship sortie, submarines track it, waiting for mistakes. The psychological effect on crews is devastating. They join the Navy to fight. Instead, they sit rotting in anchorages, reading mail from home that describes increasing hunger and privation. The war is being lost while they watch from the sidelines, unable to help because petroleum chemistry won't cooperate. The strategic planning for autumn 1944 revolves entirely around fuel constraints. The Naval General Staff proposes Shogo, Victory Operation, as a response to anticipated American landings in the Philippines. As the plan is operationally audacious, sortie the entire combined fleet, engage American invasion forces, destroy their carriers, and save the Philippines. It's also a one-way trip. Staff officers calculate that ships can carry enough fuel to reach the Philippines from Singapore, but not enough to return. The plan essentially commits the fleet to destruction in exchange for one final chance at victory. Junior officers listening to these briefings understand they were receiving death sentences delivered in polite military language. The alternative is allowing American forces to conquer the Philippines unopposed, cutting Japan off from Southeast Asian resources permanently. The choice is between dying now with a slim chance of victory or dying slowly in port while watching the empire collapse. That the fuel shortage has eliminated every option except degrees of desperation. September 1944. Naval Ministry conference rooms fill with technical officers discussing synthetic fuel programs that have failed catastrophically. Japan invested millions of yen in coal liquefaction plants designed to convert abundant coal into liquid fuel. The technology works in theory. Germany has implemented similar programs with moderate success, but Japanese facilities achieve less than 1% of required output. The plants require massive infrastructure, skilled technical workers, and electrical power that Japan's bombed-out electrical grid can't provide. What little synthetic fuel gets produced is so contaminated with impurities that it fouls aircraft engines. Pilots report chronic mechanical failures after using synthetic fuel, that some refuse to fly with it in their tanks, preferring to wait for real petroleum even though supplies are critically short. The synthetic fuel program, meant to save Japan from oil dependence, instead wastes resources that could have been spent on the conventional production. It's another example of Japanese technological capability that can't scale to industrial requirements. October 1944. Battleship Yamato's crew prepares for what everyone knows is a suicide mission. The ship takes on fuel oil until tanks overflow, crew stuffing every available void with petroleum. They exceed safe loading limits because return voyage isn't planned. Yamato will carry enough fuel for one direction only, from Singapore to the Philippines. The crew understands. They're not sailing to battle. They're sailing to death. With the slim hope of taking American ships with them, similar scenes play out across the fleet. Cruisers, destroyers, carriers, all load maximum fuel, knowing they won't be coming back. The fuel shortage has transformed tactical calculations into existential questions. Officers don't plan operations anymore. They plan funerals. The mathematics of petroleum chemistry have defeated the mathematics of gunnery. Japanese naval officers spent decades studying ballistics, armor penetration, torpedo angles. All that knowledge becomes irrelevant when you can't move your ships to where the enemy is. The domestic fuel situation is even worse than military shortages suggest. Civilian fuel consumption has been cut 95% from pre-war levels. Automobiles barely operate. Only government vehicles and emergency services receive fuel rations. Public transportation depends on wood gas generators that convert charcoal into combustible gas, a technology so inefficient that buses travel perhaps 10 miles per hour. Fishing fleets sit idle in harbors because there's no fuel for trawlers. This creates food shortages, compounding existing rationing. The military gets priority, but military consumption is so vast that civilian allocations shrink to nearly nothing. By late 1944, Tokyo residents walk or bicycle because alternatives require petroleum products that don't exist. The empire that conquered Southeast Asia for its oil can't fuel vehicles in its own capital. The irony is lost on nobody. The final accounting of Japan's oil crisis reveals decisions made in 1941 that guaranteed defeat by 1944. Japan needed minimum 50 million barrels of petroleum annually to sustain both military and civilian operations. The Dutch East Indies produced approximately 60 million barrels per year, theoretically sufficient. But capturing territory and extracting resources are different challenges. Japan conquered oil fields, but couldn't defend the tanker routes. They built refineries, but couldn't protect them from bombing. They processed crude, but couldn't deliver finished products to where they were needed. The fundamental flaw was assuming military success would solve economic problems. Instead, military operations consumed oil faster than economic systems could replace it. By October 1944, combined fleet fuel stocks stand at 630,000 kiloliters, enough for approximately 3 months of defensive operations, or one major offensive. Admiral Toyota chooses the offensive. The fleet will sortie to the Philippines, fight one last battle, and die there when the fuel runs out. It's not strategy anymore. It's not even tactics. It's arithmetic with human lives as the remainder. The oil choke point has tightened into a noose that no amount of courage or skill can escape. Japan is losing the war not because American ships are better, but because American tankers can reach their destinations. The mathematics of petroleum logistics defeat the mathematics of gunnery. It's as simple and as devastating as that. November 1943. IUSS Montpellier's Combat Information Center glows with phosphorescent radar displays, showing Japanese cruisers at 35,000 yards in the pitch darkness of Empress Augusta Bay. The operators don't see ships. They see electronic returns, anonymous blips representing tonnages of steel moving through the night. Lieutenant Commander John Mulholland, the ship's gunnery officer, reads the display like a book. He doesn't need to see the enemy. The radar tells him everything: range, bearing, speed, course. Fire control computers translate this information into gunnery solutions. When Montpellier's 6-inch guns open fire at 34,000 yards, the Japanese don't even know they're under attack yet. Shells bracket the Japanese cruiser Sendai before her lookout spot muzzle flashes. This is the future of naval warfare. It's invisible, incomprehensible to officers trained in visual gunnery. The Americans have transformed darkness from an advantage for Japanese night fighting specialists into a stage where electronic eyes see everything. The revolution isn't dramatic. It doesn't involve heroic charges or desperate last stands. It involves men staring at cathode ray tubes while enemy ships explode miles beyond human vision. The romance of naval warfare dies here, replaced by the cold effectiveness of applied physics. The radar gap between American and Japanese forces grows wider throughout 1944. American destroyers carry SG surface search radar, capable of detecting ships at 40,000 yards, 8 nautical miles beyond visual range and darkness. Larger ships mount more powerful sets with even longer reach. The radar integrates directly with fire control systems, allowing gunnery computers to generate firing solutions without human observation. Japanese forces, by contrast, rely primarily on optical systems. Large binoculars, excellent night vision training, experience reading the ocean surface for ship wakes. These systems worked brilliantly in early war night actions around Guadalcanal, but they depend on Japanese superiority in night vision and seamanship. Radar makes those skills irrelevant. No amount of training helps when enemy guns open fire from beyond visual range with uncanny accuracy. The best night fighter in the world is helpless against an opponent who can see in absolute darkness using electronic eyes. January 1944. Japanese cruiser Noshiro receives one of the first Japanese-produced radar sets, a Type 22 surface search radar, installed after months of delay. The technical officers demonstrate its capabilities to the captain, showing how it can detect large ships at 15 miles in good conditions. The captain is underwhelmed. 15 miles is barely beyond visual range on clear nights. American radar operates effectively at 40 miles, often more. The Japanese set requires constant maintenance because electronics components are scarce and unreliable. Vacuum tubes fail regularly. The magnetron that generates radio waves overheats if operated continuously. Worse, Japanese radar lacks the frequency diversity and pulse compression that make American sets resistant to jamming and clutter. The Type 22 was obsolete before installation, representing where American technology was in 1942. Meanwhile, the American sets in 1944 incorporate proximity fuses that automatically detonate anti-aircraft shells near targets, radar altimeters that help night bombing, and identification friend or foe systems that prevent friendly fire. The technology gap is generational. June 1944. USS Enterprise's Combat Information Center during the Philippine Sea Battle resembles a miniature war college. Radar operators track over 50 separate contacts simultaneously, distinguishing Japanese formations by altitude, speed, and approach vector. Fighter directors vector Hellcats to intercepts using radar tracks precise enough to guide fighters within visual range of targets they couldn't possibly spot otherwise. The Japanese attempting similar operations, they rely on voice radio reports from pilots who often can't determine their own positions accurately. Japanese fighter direction consists of shouting general directions over crowded radio channels while pilots try to find enemies through visual search. The Americans can track individual aircraft from 100 miles away, predict their courses, and position interceptors with mathematical precision. This isn't just technological advantage, it's a fundamental change in how naval warfare operates. The side with better radar doesn't need better pilots or tactics. They just need competent execution of what radar technology enables. Superior situational awareness trumps superior skill. The cultural factors inhibiting Japanese radar development reveal institutional failures beyond simple technology gaps. As the Japanese naval philosophy emphasized spiritual qualities, fighting spirit, warrior ethos, superior training over technical systems, radar seemed almost dishonorable, like replacing swordsmanship with firearms. Officers who spent decades mastering night combat techniques didn't want to admit that electronics could replace their skills. When junior officers proposed accelerating radar development, senior admirals dismissed these suggestions as defeatist thinking. Real warriors didn't need electronic crutches. This attitude persisted even as American radar-directed gunfire systematically destroyed Japanese ships that couldn't effectively return fire. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this position while losing battles became unsustainable only after the loss rate made denial impossible. October 19, 1944. The Battle of Surigao Strait unfolds in darkness as Japanese Admiral Shoji Nishimura's force transits the narrow waters south of Leyte Gulf. American battleships, veterans of Pearl Harbor, including USS West Virginia, raised from the harbor mud and rebuilt with the latest radar, wait in ambush at the strait's northern end. The Japanese battleships Yamashiro and Fuso steamed toward their doom in a formation that would have been tactically brilliant in 1920. Their crews are prepared for visual gunnery duel, searchlight actions, torpedo attacks at close range. What they get is radar-directed fire from 22,800 yards, over 12 miles, before they even know American ships are present. West Virginia's Mark 8 fire control radar achieves a firing solution so accurate that her first salvo straddles Yamashiro. Its subsequent salvos walk onto target with mechanical precision. Other American battleships join the firing. Yamashiro and Fuso are bracketed, struck, burning, and doomed within minutes. Fuso breaks in half from magazine explosions. Yamashiro capsizes after absorbing dozens of hits. Neither Japanese battleship fires a shot in return because they can't find targets in the darkness. It's not even a battle, it's an execution, orchestrated by radar operators reading cathode ray tubes and pressing buttons. The anti-aircraft applications of radar prove even more revolutionary. Proximity-fused shells, radio-equipped projectiles that detonate automatically when near aircraft, transform anti-aircraft gunnery from spray and pray to genuine threat. A Japanese aircraft approaching American task forces enter a gauntlet of proximity-fused fire that doesn't need direct hits to damage or destroy. The shells burst automatically when radar detects an aircraft within lethal radius. Gun directors track aircraft with radar precision, feeding continuous firing solutions to automated gun mounts. The 5-inch .38 gun, when radar directed with proximity-fused ammunition, achieves kill rates that seemed impossible in 1942. American ships that would have been overwhelmed by aerial attack 3 years earlier now routinely survive concentrated strikes. Japanese pilots approaching American fleets describe the defensive fire as an impenetrable wall. They're not exaggerating. The wall is woven from radar beams and radio-fused explosions, invisible until lethal. The final assessment of radar's impact shows how technology can shift warfare paradigms without public recognition. Radar didn't produce dramatic newspaper headlines like aircraft carriers or atomic bombs, but it enabled every other American advantage. Night operations became routine because radar saw through darkness. Fighter direction became precise because radar tracked aircraft beyond visual range. Gunnery became accurate because radar measured range and bearing continuously. Anti-aircraft defense became effective because radar-directed proximity fuses multiplied lethality. The cumulative effect transformed American naval forces from tactically inferior in 1942 to overwhelmingly superior by 1944. At Japanese forces that might have competed on roughly even terms, if both sides fought visually, found themselves outmatched when fighting electronically. The best night fighters, most experienced lookouts, and most skilled gunners meant nothing against sensors that made darkness transparent and fire control that automated complex calculations. Japan's late and inadequate radar development condemned their forces to fighting battles where the enemy could see and they couldn't. By war's end, American radar technology had advanced so far beyond Japanese capabilities that comparison became meaningless. The revolution was invisible to observers, but absolutely decisive in outcome. The future belonged to electronics, and Japan arrived too late to compete. October 24, 1944. The Sibuyan Sea, Central Philippines. A battleship Musashi, sister to the mighty Yamato, and pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, steams eastward as part of Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force. The ship displaces 72,000 tons fully loaded, mounts 9 18-inch guns capable of throwing a shell 26 miles, and wears armor plate thick enough to stop any conventional weapon. Her designers claimed she was unsinkable. Starting at 10:30 hours, American carrier aircraft will spend the next 9 hours testing that claim. The first wave arrives from USS Intrepid, dive bombers and torpedo planes coordinated in the kind of strike Japanese forces once executed flawlessly. Musashi's anti-aircraft guns fill the sky with fire, but American pilots press through. Torpedoes slam into the port side. Bombs penetrate the armored deck. Air damage control parties race to seal breaches while the ship maintains formation and speed. At 1300 hours, the second wave arrives. More torpedoes, more bombs. Musashi begins listing. By 1500 hours, after absorbing 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes, the greatest battleship ever built is dying. Water floods compartments faster than pumps can clear it. At 1935 hours, Musashi capsizes and sinks, taking half her crew of 2,300 men to the bottom. The unsinkable ship is gone. Admiral Kurita delays to regroup but continues eastward. His mission allows no turning back. The Battle of Leyte Gulf represents Japan's final desperate attempt to reverse the war's momentum through a complex, coordinated operation that requires perfect timing and flawless execution. The plan, a designated Show 1 Go, calls for 3 separate forces to converge on American invasion, beaches in Leyte Gulf from different directions. Admiral Ozawa's carrier force, 4 carriers with minimal aircraft, serving essentially as bait, will approach from the north, drawing away Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. While Halsey chases Ozawa, Admiral Kurita's center force will transit San Bernardino Strait and fall on the invasion beaches from the north. Simultaneously, Admiral Nishimura's southern force will push through Surigao Strait from the south. The invasion fleet, caught between multiple forces without carrier protection, will be annihilated. On paper, the plan has elegant simplicity. In reality, it requires communication coordination, timing precision, and tactical flexibility that Japan's command structure can no longer provide. In it, every element must work perfectly. None will. October 25, 1942, 0658 hours. Off the coast of Samar, northeast of Leyte Gulf, Ensign William Brooks, standing watch on escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, spots anti-aircraft fire on the horizon. Minutes later, pagoda masts appear, the distinctive silhouette of Japanese battleships and cruisers. Admiral Kurita's center force has successfully transited San Bernardino Strait during the night. Unopposed, because Halsey took every available ship north, chasing Ozawa's carriers. Now, Kurita's 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers have surprised Taffy 3, 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts under Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. The escort carriers are thin-skinned, converted merchant hulls with single 5-inch guns. They cannot outrun battleships, cannot outgun cruisers, and carry only aircraft intended for ground support, not anti-ship strikes. Admiral Sprague realizes immediately that his force faces annihilation. He orders full speed away, launches all available aircraft regardless of armament, and radios for help that won't arrive in time. His destroyers and destroyer escorts, commanded to make smoke and conduct torpedo attacks, Prepare to die buying time for the carriers. 0720 hours. Commander Ernest Evans aboard destroyer USS. Johnston makes a decision that defines naval heroism. His ship displaces 2,100 tons. The Japanese battleship Congo displaces 32,000 tons, mounts 14-inch guns, and whereas armor plate Johnston's 5-inch guns cannot penetrate. Evans orders attack anyway. Johnston charges directly at the center force at 35 knots, her crew manning torpedo tubes and guns. At 10,000 yards, suicidally close, Johnston launches 10 torpedoes. At least one hits heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off the bow and forcing Kumano out of formation. Japanese shells bracket Johnston immediately. A 14-inch shell from Congo penetrates the engine room, killing everyone inside and cutting speed in half. 3 6-inch shells from cruisers wreck the bridge. Evans, wounded and partially deafened, continues fighting from the shattered wreckage of his command station. Johnston's 5-inch guns fire continuously at Japanese ships, achieving minor damage but critically forcing Japanese captains to maneuver defensively, is disrupting formation and buying precious minutes. For the next 2 hours, Johnston and her sister, ships Hole and Samuel B. Roberts, conduct what amounts to a cavalry charge against tanks. They're destroyed systematically, but their sacrifice creates chaos in Kurita's formation. The escort carriers, racing south at maximum speed while making smoke, launch every available aircraft. Pilots take off with whatever ordnance happens to be loaded, often just machine guns and small bombs meant for ground targets. They attack Japanese battleships with weapons that cannot possibly sink them, but harassment and near misses force Japanese ships to maneuver constantly. Some pilots make dry runs after expending ammunition, simulating attacks to keep Japanese anti-aircraft gunners occupied. IFM-2 Wildcat fighters strafe battleship bridges with 50 caliber machine guns that cannot penetrate armor but kill exposed personnel. Avenger torpedo bombers drop depth charges meant for submarines onto cruiser decks, achieving minimal damage but maximum psychological effect. The attacks are desperate, improvised, and individually futile. Collectively, they create an impression of coordinated opposition that doesn't actually exist. Admiral Kurita, watching aircraft swarm his formation while destroyers charge through smokescreens, becomes convinced he's facing fleet carriers with proper escorts, not the auxiliary vessels he's actually engaging. By 0930 hours, the situation for Taffy 3 appears terminal. Escort carrier Gambier Bay, struck repeatedly by cruiser shells, capsizes, and sinks. Eddie Johnston is dead in the water and sinking. Hole has disappeared beneath the waves. Samuel B. Roberts is a burning wreck. The surviving carriers are taking hits. Admiral Sprague broadcasts desperate appeals for help, but the nearest American fleet carriers are hours away. Then, inexplicably at 10:30 hours, Japanese ships begin turning away. Admiral Kurita, his force scattered across miles of ocean, receiving reports of continuous air attacks, convinced he's facing a far larger force than actually exists, makes the fateful decision to withdraw. His radio operators intercept confusing messages about American carriers to the north, actually Ozawa's decoy force engaging Halsey. Kurita becomes convinced he's sailed into a trap. He orders retreat through San Bernardino Strait. The Japanese center force, and having achieved tactical surprise and holding overwhelming firepower advantage, withdraws before accomplishing its strategic objective. The reasons remain debated decades later: fatigue, communication failures, disorientation, overestimation of American strength. Whatever the cause, Kurita pulls back when victory over the invasion beaches lay within his grasp. Admiral Nishimura's southern force faces different fate. Late on October 24th, his force of 2 battleships, 1 cruiser, and 4 destroyers enters Surigao Strait, where 6 American battleships wait in ambush. The Japanese sail into a perfectly executed trap. American destroyers launch 54 torpedoes from the flanks. Battleship Fuso explodes and breaks in half. The surviving ships continue northward into concentrated gunfire from American battleships, 5 of which were damaged at Pearl Harbor and raised specifically to exact revenge. Radar-directed fire from ranges exceeding 20,000 yards obliterates Nishimura's force. Battleship Yamashiro, struck by dozens of shells, capsizes, and sinks. Admiral Nishimura goes down with his flagship. Only one destroyer escapes. It's the last time in history that battleships fight battleships, and it's not a fight. It's an execution orchestrated by radar technology against an enemy still fighting visually. The northern action, where Halsey's Third Fleet engages Ozawa's carrier decoys, becomes an embarrassment for both sides. Halsey, taking the bait completely, races north with every available carrier and battleship, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. When he finally catches Ozawa's carriers on October 25th, American aircraft sink all four: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chaitos, and Chiyoda. Zuikaku, last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, goes down with her battle flags flying. But the victory feels hollow when Halsey receives frantic radio calls from Taffy, 3 describing battleship attack. He's been lured 200 miles out of position, while Kurita threatened the invasion beaches. Admiral Chester Nimitz, monitoring radio traffic from Pearl Harbor, sends Halsey a terse message. Where is Task Force 34? The implied rebuke stings. Halsey turns south, but arrives hours too late. Kurita has already withdrawn. The battle becomes 4 separate engagements rather than one coordinated action, with neither side executing their plan effectively. The final accounting of Lady Gulf tallies the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 personnel participated across 282 ships. Japan committed virtually everything that could float and fight: 4 carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, 34 destroyers. They lost 4 carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. American losses total 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort. The exchange ratio is devastating. More importantly, Japan's combined fleet effectively ceases to exist as a fighting force. What ships survive lack fuel for major operations. The carriers have no aircraft, battleships have no support vessels, and the entire organizational structure has been shattered. Individual ships still fight on. Yamato will make one final sortie. Submarines continue operating. Coastal defense forces remain active. But the combined fleet as an entity capable of contesting American naval supremacy is dead. The Battle of Lady Gulf doesn't just defeat Japan's navy, it eliminates it. The mystery of Kurita's withdrawal haunts analysis for decades. He held overwhelming firepower advantage at the decisive moment. The invasion beaches lay 30 miles away, packed with transports and supply ships. 1 hour of gunnery could have destroyed them. Instead, he turned back, citing confused intelligence about American fleet positions and fear of air attack. Survivors from Taffy 3 couldn't believe their salvation. Admiral Sprague wrote afterward that his escape felt miraculous. In reality, it resulted from Japanese command confusion, communication failures, and Kurita's exhaustion after 3 days of continuous operations. The decision probably saved thousands of American lives. It also ended any possibility of Japan achieving strategic success through naval operations. After Lady Gulf, Japan's maritime strategy reduces to dying slowly, while making the cost as high as possible. There are no more offensive options, no more strategic gambits, no more chances to reverse the tide. The combined fleet sailed to Lady Gulf with one final desperate hope. It sank there, along with that hope, in the deep waters of the Philippine Sea. May 8, 1942. USS Yorktown's hangar deck erupts in flame as a Japanese bomb penetrates 4 decks and explodes near the forward elevator. Aviation fuel ignites. Ammunition begins cooking off in the intense heat. The carrier lists as waterfloods compartments from near-miss damage. For most warships, this represents a death sentence. Yorktown's damage control parties think differently. Within minutes, teams have foam generators operating, smothering fires before they spread. Portable pumps counterflood undamaged compartments, correcting the list. Welders seal damaged plates while the ship maintains speed. Electricians reroute power around destroyed sections. 20 minutes after the bomb hit, fires are extinguished. 2 hours later, Yorktown's flight deck resumes operations. The carrier recovers aircraft, refuels them, and launches them for further strikes as if nothing happened. She's wounded but functional. 1 month later, Yorktown will fight at Midway, despite damage that should have required months of repairs. A Japanese submarine will finally sink her, but only after she absorbs far more punishment than her designers thought possible. The difference between Yorktown surviving and Japanese carriers burning to death from single hits isn't luck. It's engineering philosophy, training culture, and institutional commitment to damage control as warfare's unglamorous but essential foundation. The contrast becomes stark at Midway on June 4th, when single bomb hits doom 3 Japanese carriers within minutes. Akagi takes 1 bomb near the midships elevator. The explosion penetrates to the hangar deck, where fully fueled and armed aircraft sit in preparation for launch. Secondary explosions rip through the ship as bombs and torpedoes detonate in chain reactions. If fire mains, inadequately protected, rupture immediately, leaving damage control parties with hand pumps and buckets. The wooden flight deck, chosen to save weight, feeds the flames rather than containing them. Within hours, Akagi, flagship of the Kido Butai, veteran of Pearl Harbor, is abandoned and scuttled. Similar fates befall Keiga and Soryu. Each takes relatively minor initial damage that metastasizes into uncontrollable catastrophe because Japanese damage control systems and training prove inadequate. American observers studying Japanese carrier design after the war find the fatal flaws obvious in hindsight. Wooden flight decks, inadequate fire suppression systems, poor compartmentalization, minimal crew training, and the damage control procedures. Japanese naval architects prioritized offensive capability, aircraft capacity, speed, strike range, over survivability. The philosophy worked brilliantly until someone hit back. March 19, 1945. USS Franklin, operating off Japan, takes 2 bombs from a lone Japanese aircraft that penetrates the combat air patrol. The first bomb strikes the aft flight deck, penetrating to the hangar. The second hits farther forward, also reaching the hangar. Both detonate among fully armed and fueled aircraft preparing for strikes. The resulting explosions kill 724 men instantly, more casualties than any American ship suffers in a single attack during the entire war. Fire sweeps through the hangar deck. Aviation fuel floods spaces and ignites. Bombs detonate, each explosion triggering more blasts. The ship lists 13 degrees. The entire island structure becomes a furnace. Its observers from other ships assume Franklin is doomed and begin rescue operations for survivors. Captain Leslie Garris refuses to abandon ship. Damage control parties fight flames with every available resource while the carrier continues listing. They pump water, clear debris, seal breaches, and somehow prevent magazine explosions that would have destroyed the ship. Franklin survives, though barely. She's towed initially, then limps back to New York under her own power. The damage is so extensive that she never returns to combat. But she survives, taking more battle damage than any American carrier and remaining afloat when comparable damage would have sunk any Japanese carrier immediately. The engineering philosophy differences extend beyond armor and fire suppression into basic design principles. All our American carriers feature steel flight decks on Essex and Midway classes, though Yorktown and Enterprise classes use wood for weight savings. All American carriers incorporate multiple fire mains running through protected passages, ensuring some water pressure survives most damage. Compartmentalization prevents flooding in one area from spreading uncontrollably. Fuel lines route through protected spaces, with isolation valves, allowing damaged sections to be sealed off. These design features cost weight and reduce aircraft capacity, creating measurable offensive disadvantages, but they transform carriers from fragile eggs into resilient warships that can absorb hits and keep fighting. Japanese carriers, designed to maximize strike capability, sacrifice these protective features. The result is ships that perform brilliantly when undamaged, but die quickly when hurt. The training culture matters as much as engineering. Every sailor in the U.S. Navy receives damage control training as part of basic instruction. Firefighting, compartment sealing, pump operation, and emergency repair techniques are universal skills, not specialist knowledge. When disaster strikes, every crew member can contribute to saving the ship. Japanese training concentrates damage control expertise in specialized teams. When those teams are killed or overwhelmed, common in major damage situations, the remaining crew lacks skills to help effectively. This distinction becomes critical when ships take heavy damage. American vessels have hundreds of trained damage control personnel immediately available. Japanese ships have dozens. The mathematical advantage multiplies during crisis situations where every second and every hand matters. June 19, 1944. Carrier Taiho, newest and most modern vessel in the Japanese fleet, takes a single torpedo from submarine USS Albacore. The hit floods an aviation fuel tank. Serious but not immediately fatal damage. Taiho maintains speed and continues operations, but ruptured fuel lines leak gasoline vapor into closed spaces throughout the ship. A damage control officer, attempting to clear the vapor, makes a catastrophic decision. He opens ventilation systems to increase air circulation, assuming dilution will render the vapor harmless. Instead, the ventilation spreads explosive vapor throughout the vessel. For 6 hours, Taiho operates normally while becoming a floating bomb. Multiple crew members smell gasoline fumes and report them, but nobody realizes the extent of vapor accumulation. At 15:32 hours, a spark, possibly from an elevator motor, finds the vapor cloud. The explosion lifts Taiho's armored flight deck vertically, buckling steel plate designed to resist direct bomb hits. Secondary explosions rip through the hull as fuel and ordnance detonate. The carrier settles rapidly and sinks, taking 1,650 crew with her. A single torpedo shouldn't have killed such a heavily built ship. Poor damage control decisions transformed survivable damage into catastrophe. The same afternoon, submarine USS Kavala puts 3 torpedoes into carrier Shokaku. The veteran ship, survivor of Coral Sea and Santa Cruz, has served since 1941. The torpedo damage floods multiple compartments and starts fires near aviation fuel tanks. Shokaku's damage control teams fight valiantly, but the ship's design works against them. Inadequate compartmentalization allows flooding to spread. Fire suppression systems prove insufficient. Aviation fuel ignites, and the flames spread faster than crews can contain them. Unlike Taiho's sudden explosion, Shokaku dies slowly over 3 hours as progressive flooding and fire overwhelm damage control efforts. Survivors describe watching helplessly as their ship succumbs to damage that better systems might have contained. Shokaku sinks with 1,200 crew lost, another carrier destroyed by damage that American engineering philosophy and training might have survived. The statistical analysis of carrier losses reveals the damage control gap's decisive impact. American carriers average 3.2 bomb or torpedo hits before sinking. Japanese carriers average 1.8 hits before becoming losses. The difference isn't armor thickness or hull strength, it's damage control capability. USS Enterprise survives the entire war despite taking multiple bomb hits at Eastern Solomons, Battle of Santa Cruz, and during the Philippines campaign. USS Saratoga absorbs 3 separate torpedo attacks and returns to service each time. USS Lexington at Coral Sea and USS Yorktown at Midway survive initial damage but succumb to secondary effects. Gasoline vapor explosions and submarine torpedo attacks respectively, that overwhelm even American damage control. The Japanese lose carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, A's and Hiryu at Midway to single bomb hits each. They lose Shokaku and Taiho to single torpedo hits at Philippine Sea. The pattern is consistent and damning. The cultural factors reinforcing these technical differences reflect broader institutional priorities. Japanese naval tradition emphasizes offensive spirit, attacking aggressively, pressing advantages, accepting risks in pursuit of victory. Defensive measures like damage control seem less honorable, less worthy of focus. American naval culture, influenced by engineering pragmatism and industrial thinking, treats damage control as integral to combat effectiveness. You can't attack if your ship is sinking. The Americans institutionalized this philosophy through training, design, and operational doctrine. The Japanese never fully embrace it, viewing damage control as secondary to offensive capabilities until catastrophic losses make the price of this attitude clear. By war's end, the The damage control gap has contributed to every major Japanese naval defeat. Carriers lost at Midway might have survived with better fire suppression and training. Battleship Musashi, theoretically unsinkable, succumbs partially because damage control cannot keep pace with flooding from multiple torpedo hits. Even ships that should survive medium damage, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, die at rates higher than American equivalents suffering comparable damage. The gap isn't obvious in individual engagements. No battle report lists inadequate damage control as cause of defeat. But cumulative effect over hundreds of engagements creates a survival rate differential that matters enormously in attrition warfare. America can afford to lose ships occasionally because their designs and crews are optimized for survival. Japan cannot afford losses because their ships die more easily once hit. The arithmetic is brutal. If your ships sink from lighter damage and your enemy builds more ships, you lose the attrition race twice over, once from construction rates, twice from survival rates. Japan learns this lesson at catastrophic cost. The damage control gap proves as decisive as any technological advantage, killing ships and men through mundane engineering failures rather than dramatic combat action. It's an unglamorous way to lose a war, but no less final for its lack of drama. April 5, 1945. Tokuyama Anchorage, Japan's inland sea. Battleship Yamato sits low in the water, her fuel tank swollen with 2,500 tons of heavy oil, just enough for one-way voyage to Okinawa, 350 miles south. Admiral Seiichi Ito gathers the crew on deck for final briefing. The operation, designated Tengo, Operation Heaven, requires Yamato to beach herself on Okinawa's shore and fight as an unsinkable fortress, her 9 18-inch guns providing fire support until ammunition runs out, or American forces destroy her. The crew understands this is suicide disguised as tactics. Ito speaks plainly. They will not return. There is no fuel for return voyage, no air cover for the approach, no support force for rescue if Yamato sinks en route. This is the final sortie of the combined fleet, reduced now to 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 8 destroyers. The crew, 2,767 men, stand silently as Ito finishes. Some are veterans who remember Pearl Harbor, when Japan's Navy dominated the Pacific. Most are teenagers who joined a Navy that barely exists anymore. They know they're dying for nothing, accomplishing nothing, in a war already lost. But orders are orders. Bushido demands they die with honor, even in a hopeless cause. As darkness falls, Yamato weighs anchor and heads south toward oblivion. Yamato embodies Japan's battleship doctrine, taken to its logical extreme, a vessel so large and powerful that no conventional force could sink her. She displaces 72,000 tons, fully loaded, over twice the tonnage of American Iowa-class battleships. Her main battery consists of 9 Type 94 45 caliber guns, firing 18-inch shells, the largest naval artillery ever deployed. Each shell weighs 3,200 pounds and can penetrate 16 inches of armor at 20 miles range. Her armor belt measures 16 inches thick amidships, widening to 26 inches on the main gun turrets, theoretically proof against any naval gun afloat. Her designers calculated that Yamato could engage any 3 American battleships simultaneously and destroy them all. These calculations assumed battleship versus battleship combat. They never seriously contemplated what 300 carrier aircraft could accomplish. April 6, 1945. Yamato clears the Bungo Strait and enters the Philippine Sea, heading southwest toward Okinawa at 20 knots. American submarines track her immediately. By evening, Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding 5th Fleet off Okinawa, knows Yamato's course, speed, and likely mission. The timing seems almost insulting. Yamato is making her death ride while 5,000 American ships operate off Okinawa, including dozens of fleet carriers with over 1,000 aircraft. Spruance orders Admiral Mark Mitcher to handle the situation. Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, launches full deck-load strikes from multiple carriers. The aircraft begin taking off at dawn on April 7th. Over 380 aircraft will attack in coordinated waves, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. The strike represents more air power than many battles involve. Against one battleship and 9 escorts, it's massive overkill. Mitcher intends to leave nothing to chance. 1220 hours, April 7th. Yamato's lookouts spot the first wave approaching from the south, 60 aircraft from carriers Hornet and Bennington. The battleship's anti-aircraft guns open fire, filling the sky with explosions. 152 25mm guns, 98 smaller automatic weapons, and 12 40mm guns create a storm of steel. The first American aircraft to die crashes in flames 2,000 yards out. More follow. But the attacks come from multiple directions simultaneously, overwhelming defenses designed for sequential engagement. Avenger torpedo bombers drop to wave-top level, approaching from port and starboard. Hellcat fighters strafe the deck, suppressing anti-aircraft positions. No Helldiver dive bombers roll into attacks from high altitude. The coordination is textbook perfect, the result of 3 years' experience perfecting carrier strike tactics against Japanese ships. 12:35 hours. The first torpedo hits Yamato's port side, flooding one boiler room. 2 more torpedoes strike in quick succession, causing progressive flooding and 5-degree list. Bombs penetrate the main deck, exploding inside the superstructure. One bomb destroys the primary fire control station, killing most of the gunnery officers and severing communications with the main battery turrets. Individual turrets engage independently, firing at visible targets without coordinated fire control. It's exactly the chaos American planners intended. Transform the battleship into a collection of isolated gun positions, rather than an integrated weapons system. More torpedo bombers press through intensifying fire. The cumulative damage is overwhelming. Yamato lists 10 degrees to port as water floods dozens of compartments faster than pumps can clear them. 1,300 hours. The second wave arrives, over 100 aircraft from carriers Essex, Intrepid, and others. The attacks continue with mechanical precision. Torpedo after torpedo slams into Yamato's hull. Her designers built watertight compartmentation into the structure, but the sheer volume of flooding defeats these protections. Damage control parties struggle to seal breaches while new torpedoes open fresh holes. The list increases to 15 degrees. Counter-flooding to correct the list fails because too many compartments are already flooded. 20 degrees. Communications between bridge and engineering spaces fail as electrical systems short out. Individual compartments fight their own battles against flooding, isolated from any coordinated damage control. 25 degrees. Crew begins abandoning damaged sections, but escape routes are cut off by fire or water. Men drown in darkness, trapped in compartments below the waterline. 1,405 hours. After absorbing 11 torpedo hits, 6 bomb hits, and countless near misses, Yamato's list passes 30 degrees. The ship is dying. Admiral Ito orders abandon ship. He remains on the bridge, having decided to go down with his command. Captain Kosaku Aruga makes the same choice, all binding himself to the compass binnacle so he'll sink with Yamato. Throughout the ship, hundreds of crew make individual decisions to stay or go. Some can't escape, trapped below decks as water rises. Others choose to remain, viewing abandonment as dishonor. The list continues increasing. 35 degrees, 40 degrees. Men slide across decks tilted at impossible angles. Equipment breaks loose and crashes through bulkheads. 45 degrees. The end comes swiftly now. Yamato rolls past 50 degrees list and continues rolling. As she capsizes, magazines containing over 1,000 rounds of unspent ammunition detonate in a massive explosion, visible for 100 miles. The fireball rises into the sky, creating a mushroom cloud that reaches 2,000 feet. When the smoke clears, Yamato has vanished. 2,498 crew are dead. Only 269 survive. The strategic calculations behind Operation Tengo reveal desperation masquerading as tactics. Yamato cost approximately 140 million yen to build, equivalent to 1,000 Zero fighters or 3,000 trucks desperately needed by Japan's collapsing army. Her armor plate consumed steel that could have built dozens of escort vessels. The fuel loaded for her final sortie could have kept several squadrons operational for weeks. Instead, Everything gets sacrificed on a mission with zero chance of success. Even if Yamato reached Okinawa and beached successfully, her guns could have provided fire support for perhaps 3 days before ammunition exhaustion. The impact on the Okinawa battle, where 5,000 American ships operate, would have been negligible. The entire operation represents institutional delusion. Military leadership so divorced from strategic reality that they order meaningless suicide missions because doing nothing feels worse than dying purposelessly. The crew's response to this madness reveals cultural conditioning that prioritizes obedience and honor over survival and rationality. Over 300 sailors choose to go down with Yamato, even after abandoned ship orders. They sing the national anthem as water rises. They salute the emperor's photograph as the ship capsizes. These are acts of profound courage motivated by profoundly warped values. The same courage applied to defensive operations, to protecting merchant shipping, or to building sustainable military structures might have extended Japan's resistance significantly. Instead, it gets wasted on theatrical gestures. Yamato's crew didn't die fighting. They died participating in an elaborate suicide ritual that accomplished nothing except satisfying cultural requirements for honorable death. The line between courage and insanity becomes indistinguishable. American forces lose 10 aircraft and 12 aircrew to Yamato's anti-aircraft fire. Tragic but sustainable losses representing less than 3% of the attacking force. Task Force 58 returns to Okinawa operations within hours, having eliminated the last meaningful surface threat. Yamato's destruction barely registers in American operational planning. She was an interesting target, worth launching a major strike, but never a serious threat to the Okinawa campaign. The battleship's death matters more symbolically than tactically. She represents the end of Japan's battleship-centric doctrine, the final proof that massive guns and thick armor cannot compete against carrier aviation. More poignantly, she represents the complete collapse of rational strategic thinking. When your best remaining warship is sent on a one-way suicide mission that accomplishes nothing, you're not conducting military operations anymore. You're performing cultural theater while your nation burns. Yamato sank beneath the waves of the Philippine Sea, carrying not just crew, but the last pretense that Japan's naval forces could affect the war's outcome. What remains after April 7, 1945, are submarines continuing sporadic attacks, kite and suicide torpedoes, all kamikaze aircraft, and coastal defense forces awaiting invasion. The combined fleet is dead. Yamato was its funeral. October 25, 1944. A Zero fighter approaches the escort carrier USS St. Lo off Samar Island, Philippines. Anti-aircraft guns track the aircraft, firing steadily. The pilot doesn't maneuver defensively. He points his aircraft at the carrier's flight deck and accelerates. Gunners realize with horror that he's not attacking normally. He's deliberately crashing. The Zero strikes St. Lo's flight deck and penetrates to the hangar, its bomb detonating among fueled aircraft. Massive explosions rip through the escort carrier as aviation fuel and ordnance detonate in chain reactions. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo sinks with 114 crew killed. Vice Admiral Takijiro Onishi, watching from his headquarters, declares the attack a success. He has just invented the kamikaze, organized suicide attacks as official military policy. The word means divine wind, referencing typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century. Onishi believes these human-guided missiles represent Japan's only remaining path to victory. What he's actually created is an institutional acknowledgement that Japan can no longer fight conventionally. When your military doctrine requires pilots to deliberately kill themselves, you've admitted defeat while pretending otherwise. The kamikaze program formalizes desperation into organizational structure. Admiral Onishi establishes volunteer squadrons of pilots who will fly one-way missions, crashing explosive-laden aircraft into American ships. Initially, volunteers come forward eagerly, motivated by genuine belief they're saving Japan through ultimate sacrifice. Cultural conditioning, emperor worship, and samurai mythology create social pressure that makes refusing seem dishonorable. Young pilots volunteer knowing death is certain, accepting that their lives matter less than damaging American ships. The early kamikazes are experienced pilots flying capable aircraft, Zeros, Val dive bombers, Kate torpedo bombers. Their attacks achieve notable success because experienced pilots can penetrate defenses to reach targets. But experienced pilots are irreplaceable. Each kamikaze success destroys a resource that cannot be recreated. The program becomes self-consuming, trading quality personnel for modest tactical gains. By spring 1945, the kamikaze program has exhausted volunteers and evolved into barely disguised coercion. Volunteer requests go to pilots who understand refusal means disgrace, family dishonor, and possible execution for cowardice. Training quality collapses as green pilots receive minimal instruction before assignment to kamikaze units. Many have less than 100 hours flight time total. They can barely take off, navigate to target areas, and identify ships. Complex combat maneuvers are beyond their skill level. American fighter pilots report kamikaze aircrafts flying in straight lines, making no evasive moves when intercepted. Some kamikazes crash into the ocean through navigation errors or mechanical failures, never reaching American ships. The attack effectiveness declines monthly as pilot quality degrades and American defenses adapt. As to January through June 1945, Operation Kikusui, Floating Chrysanthemums, unfolds in 10 mass attacks against American forces off Okinawa. Over 1,500 kamikaze aircraft participate, along with conventional attack aircraft. April 6th sees the largest attack. 355 kamikazes plus 300 conventional aircraft assault the invasion fleet. 6 ships sink, 18 suffer damage, but 300 Japanese aircraft are destroyed, most by defending fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The trade ratios are mathematically insane. Japan exchanges 4,000 aircraft and pilots for 47 ships sunk, mostly destroyers and smaller vessels, and 300 damaged. Many damaged ships return to service within weeks. Some, like destroyer USS Laffey, become legends. That Laffey survives 6 kamikaze hits plus 4 bomb strikes in 80 minutes on April 16th. 32 crew die, but the ship survives and eventually returns to service. The ship that wouldn't die demonstrates that even kamikaze attacks can be absorbed if damage control is adequate. The Chiton program represents underwater kamikaze, human-guided torpedoes that cannot return. Based on Type 93 Long Lance torpedo technology, Chiton are 48 feet long, carry 3,300 pounds of explosives, and are piloted by single occupants sealed inside with no escape mechanism. Volunteers train at bases on Otsushima Island, learning to guide weapons that are also their coffins. The success rate is abysmal. Of approximately 100 Chiton deployed operationally, then only 2 confirmed sinkings result: tanker USS Mississiniwa and landing ship LST-472. Over 80 Chiton are lost without achieving hits, their pilots dead for nothing. American anti-submarine warfare, sonar, depth charges, destroyer escort groups, proves too effective. Most Chiton are sunk before reaching targets. Others malfunction, flooding or losing steering, killing pilots without accomplishing anything. The few that succeed demonstrate that Chiton can work. The overwhelming failures prove they don't work sustainably. The psychological toll on American sailors facing kamikaze attacks is profound but cannot break American resolve. Radar picket destroyers stationed around Okinawa endure days of continuous kamikaze assault, cruise at battle stations for weeks straight. The stress is enormous, watching suicide aircraft approach, knowing that shootdowns must be perfect, because wounded aircraft still crash effectively. Sleep deprivation, constant alerts, and watching ships burn nearby create trauma that many sailors carry for life. But the ships keep fighting, the defenses keep improving, and the fleet never withdraws. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells increase kill rates dramatically. Fighter direction improves, vectoring combat air patrol to intercept kamikazes farther from the fleet. Tactical adjustments reduce effectiveness over time. Japan is trading lives for diminishing returns. The strategic incoherence of suicide tactics becomes clear through mathematical analysis. 2,800 kamikaze attacks kill 4,900 American sailors, roughly 1.7 deaths per attack. The attacks sink 47 ships, damage 300 more. This seems significant until compared to costs. Japan expends 4,000 aircraft and pilots that might otherwise conduct conventional attacks with survival possible. If those 4,000 pilots flew even 3 missions each before being killed, a conservative estimate, they'd conduct 12,000 attack sorties instead of 4,000 suicide runs. The potential damage would far exceed what suicide attacks achieved, but conducting conventional attacks requires fuel, ordnance, training, and organizational capability Japan no longer possesses. Kamikaze attacks simplify logistics, minimal fuel for one-way trips, pilots need minimal training, organization reduces to pointing desperate volunteers at enemies. It's strategically insane but tactically expedient, one which summarizes Japan's entire situation by 1945. The cultural implications of institutionalized suicide remain contentious. Some historians argue kamikazes represent ultimate military dedication, soldiers making supreme sacrifice to defend their homeland. Others view the program as criminal abuse of young men by leadership that had already lost the war but refused to admit it. Both perspectives contain truth. Individual kamikaze pilots often display genuine courage and sincere belief in their mission. The system that created and exploited that courage was morally bankrupt, sacrificing lives for negligible strategic gain when negotiated surrender could have saved hundreds of thousands of lives on both sides. Admiral Onishi, architect of the kamikaze program, committed ritual suicide on August 16th. In 1945, one day after Japan's surrender, his suicide note apologized to kamikaze pilots, acknowledging their deaths accomplished nothing. This belated recognition of futility offers cold comfort to the families of 4,000 dead pilots. The final assessment of Japan's suicide tactics shows desperation masquerading as determination. Kamikazes and kaiten represent not innovation, but capitulation. Admission that conventional warfare is no longer possible. When your military doctrine requires systemic self-destruction, you've lost not just battles, but institutional sanity. The tactics worked marginally, achieving some successes while failing strategically. They imposed casualties on Americans, but couldn't alter the war's trajectory. Most critically, they consumed irreplaceable human resources. Pilots and submariners who might have contributed to Japan's post-war reconstruction instead died pointlessly in the war's final months. The desperation's harvest was bitter. Thousands of young lives wasted, modest tactical gains achieved, strategic situation unchanged, and national psyche scarred by cultural practices that glorified death over survival. It was, perhaps, the most comprehensively failed military program of the Pacific War, succeeding only in proving that courage and sacrifice cannot substitute for rational strategy, adequate resources, or honest assessment of military reality. The divine wind never came. Only young men died, their sacrifice honored but ultimately meaningless, monuments to leadership failure rather than military innovation. July 24th, 1945. The skies above Kure Naval Base fill with American carrier aircraft. Wave after wave of Corsairs, Hellcats, Avengers, and Helldivers from Task Force 38. This isn't a battle, it's an execution. Below them, the remnants of the Imperial Japanese Navy sit at anchor, unable to move for lack of fuel, unable to fight for lack of ammunition and trained crew. Battleship Haruna, veteran of Pearl Harbor and every major engagement since, lists at her moorings already damaged by previous attacks. Carrier Amagi sits beside incomplete carrier Katsuragi, both with empty flight decks and skeleton crews. Heavy cruisers Tone and Ioba rest in shallow water, partially flooded from mine damage. The aircraft attack systematically, methodically, like workers demolishing condemned buildings. Bombs fall with practiced precision, and Haruna takes multiple hits and capsizes in the shallow harbor, her pagoda mast jutting from the water at a grotesque angle. Tone burns. Amagi settles into the mud. This continues for 3 days, British and American carrier aircraft destroying Japan's navy in its home ports because the ships lack fuel to sortie and fight. It's inglorious, humiliating, and absolutely final. the Imperial Japanese Navy that dominated the Pacific in 1942, dies not in battle, but in harbor, killed like penned animals. The inventory of surviving Japanese naval forces in August 1945 reads like an obituary for a once great power. One battleship, Nagato, survives in damaged condition, her machinery barely functional. 3 carriers technically remain operational, but have no aircraft, no fuel, and crews reduced to skeleton watches. And 5 cruisers sit in various states of disrepair, most damaged beyond economical repair. 39 destroyers survive out of 168, built or commissioned during the war, a 77% loss rate. 139 submarines remain, but fuel shortages limit them to coastal defense operations. Most submarines haven't conducted offensive patrols in months. Compare this to the American Pacific Fleet: 23 battleships, 28 fleet and light carriers, over 60 cruisers, more than 300 destroyers, and over 200 submarines. The numerical disparity is so vast that comparison becomes meaningless. Japan doesn't have a navy anymore. It has rust-covered hulks awaiting scrapping. The merchant marine's destruction proves even more catastrophic than warship losses. Japan began the war with 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By August 1945, only 900,000 tons remain, an 85% destruction rate. Most survivors are small coastal vessels trapped in ports by American air supremacy and submarine blockade. The ships that made Japan's empire possible, tankers hauling oil from the Dutch East Indies, cargo vessels bringing rice from Indochina, transports supplying island garrisons, are gone. American submarines sank over 5 million tons. Aircraft destroyed another 1 million tons. Mines claimed hundreds of thousands more. The survivors cower in harbors, unable to move without being attacked. Japan's home islands face starvation, not because food doesn't exist in the empire, but because ships cannot transport it. The millions of tons of supplies sit uselessly in warehouses across Southeast Asia, while Japanese civilians eat bark and sawdust because merchant ships are dead. July 1945. The naval fuel situation has deteriorated beyond critical to non-existent. Japan's petroleum reserves total 12,000 kiloliters, enough for perhaps 2 weeks of defensive operations, if spread across the entire Navy. In practice, most vessels have no fuel at all. Destroyers tied at docks have empty bunkers. The few operational submarines surface transit to save battery power for attacks they rarely make. Training flights cease completely in May. Every drop of aviation fuel must be hoarded for kamikaze attacks and homeland defense. The battleship cruiser force cannot sortie, even if targets presented themselves. Yamato's final mission consumed the last reserves allocated for surface operations. What little fuel remains gets reserved for suicide weapons, kamikaze aircraft, Chiton torpedoes, Shinyo explosive boats. Even these programs face fuel rationing. Some kamikaze pilots are asked to share aircraft with other volunteers, taking turns flying training flights with barely enough fuel to practice takeoffs and landings. The oil choke point has tightened into a garrote that leaves Japan's military gasping. The naval aviation component that once dominated the Pacific has been reduced to ineffectual remnants. Approximately 9,000 aircraft remain in Japan in August 1945, but this number deceives. Most are obsolete trainers, worn-out fighters relegated to kamikaze duty, or incomplete aircraft awaiting parts that will never arrive. Perhaps 300 aircraft could be considered combat-ready by even generous standards. More critically, Japan has only about 300 pilots with meaningful combat experience. The elite generation that struck Pearl Harbor is dead, killed in battles from Midway to Philippine Sea, or consumed by attrition over 4 years of warfare. Their replacements received abbreviated training, died quickly, and were themselves replaced by even more poorly trained pilots in a death spiral that never recovered. By summer 1945, the average Japanese naval aviator has less flight time than American civilian flight instructors. Throwing them against battle-hardened American pilots flying superior aircraft isn't combat, it's murder. Japan stopped trying to contest air superiority months ago and reserving aircraft solely for kamikaze attacks that trade rookie pilots for modest damage to American ships. August 15th, 1945. Combined Fleet Headquarters in Tokyo receives the Emperor's surrender broadcast. Admiral Soemu Toyoda listens to the tinny radio voice announcing Japan's capitulation. His staff officers maintain rigid attention, faces revealing nothing despite the tears some cannot control. Toyoda reviews the final fleet status reports one last time, though he knows them by heart. 2 battleships survive, but only 1 can move. 4 carriers remain, but cannot operate aircraft. A handful of cruisers, destroyers, and submarines constitute the remnant of a force that once controlled the Pacific from Alaska to Australia. Over 2,000 warships built between 1941 and 1945, carriers, and battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, escorts, and 85% are destroyed. 1,728 warships sunk, torpedoed, bombed, or scuttled. The combined fleet has been annihilated so thoroughly that reconstruction would take decades. Not that reconstruction will happen. The surrender terms prohibit military forces beyond minimal self-defense. The Imperial Navy will be dissolved, its ships scrapped, or awarded to Allied powers as reparations. This is the end. August 30th, 1945. Tokyo Bay. Battleship USS Missouri drops anchor in waters the Imperial Japanese Navy claimed as sovereign territory 4 years earlier. The Iowa-class battleship displaces 45,000 tons, mounts 9 16-inch guns, and represents American technological and industrial supremacy in steel form. Japanese ships detailed to escort Missouri watch in silence as the American battle wagon dwarfs everything around her. Captain Katsuo Arita, commanding destroyer Hatsuzakura, studies Missouri through binoculars. His destroyer is 13 years old, worn out from 4 years of war, barely functional. Missouri is 2 years old, pristine, powerful beyond anything Japan ever built. The comparison summarizes the entire war. Japan began with technical parity or even advantage in some areas, but American industrial might produce successively more capable vessels in quantities Japan couldn't match. Missouri is one of 4 Iowa-class battleships, each superior to any Japanese battleship except Yamato and Musashi. And America built them as afterthoughts while focusing on carriers. Japan built Yamato and Musashi as fleet centerpieces, sacrificing other construction. Missouri floats triumphant in Tokyo Bay, while Yamato rusts on the bottom of the Philippine Sea. The symbolism requires no explanation. The human cost of naval defeat staggers comprehension. Over 300,000 Japanese naval personnel died during the war, 40% of all who served. Some died in dramatic battles that made history: Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf. Most died ungloriously, drowned when submarines torpedoed transports, burned when aircraft bombed bases, or starved when supply lines collapsed. The naval infantry troops who fought on Pacific Islands suffered particularly horrific fates, cut off from supply, reduced to eating grass and bark, and eventually dying from starvation or disease when American forces bypassed their islands. Naval air crew casualty rates approached 75% by war's end. Submarine crews died in their vessels, entombed in steel sarcophagi at crushing depths. The survivors carry physical and psychological scars that will never heal. America lost roughly 56,000 Navy and Marine Corps personnel in the Pacific War, tragic but proportionally much lower casualty rates. American ships brought their sailors home. Japanese ships often became tombs. The strategic autopsy reveals that Japanese naval defeat was overdetermined, guaranteed by multiple independent failures, any one of which might have proven fatal. The industrial production gap meant Japan couldn't replace losses. The oil shortage strangled operations. The training system collapse destroyed pilot quality. Poor damage control increased loss rates. Rigid doctrine prevented adaptation. Suicide tactics wasted resources. Technological inferiority in radar, damage control, and logistics compounded every other disadvantage. Even if Japan had solved any single problem, the remaining issues would still have defeated them. The decisive moment probably came at Midway. when carrier losses couldn't be replaced and pilot casualties couldn't be absorbed. But Midway only accelerated defeat that mathematics had already determined. Japan's naval forces peaked in December 1941 and declined thereafter, losing capability monthly through attrition they couldn't reverse. By mid-1943, strategic defeat was certain. By mid-1944, naval operations became desperation. And by mid-1945, nothing remained but waiting for surrender terms. September 2nd, 1945. Missouri's deck hosts the formal surrender ceremony. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu and General Yoshijiro Umezu sign the instruments of surrender, while representatives from America, Britain, China, and other allied nations witness. Overhead, hundreds of American aircraft fly in formation, a demonstration of the air supremacy that made Japan's defeat inevitable. In harbors across Japan, the remnants of the Imperial Navy sit silent, their battle flags struck, their crews awaiting demobilization. Some officers choose suicide rather than accept defeat. Admiral Takejiro Onishi and Admiral Matome Ugaki among them. Most accept survival and begin the long process of rebuilding a shattered nation. If the Imperial Japanese Navy, founded in 1872, expanded into the world's third largest navy by 1941 and destroyed by 1945, is formally dissolved. Its history ends not with triumph, but with absolute defeat, its ships scrapped, its traditions discontinued, its legacy one of spectacular failure. The end has come, comprehensive and irreversible. The combined fleet is no more. October 1945. Omori prisoner of war camp, Tokyo. Admiral Soemu Toyota sits across a table from American naval intelligence officers, cigarette smoke drifting through the interrogation room. The Americans ask precise questions about Japanese operational planning, decision-making processes, and strategic assessments. Toyota's answers reveal a man who commanded forces without fully understanding the war he was fighting. He insists Japanese planning was sound, tactics appropriate, execution generally satisfactory. When confronted with production statistics showing 10-to-1 American advantages, Toyota dismisses them as propaganda. Even now, after comprehensive defeat, after watching Japan's cities burned and her navy destroyed, the admiral cannot accept that American industrial superiority was as overwhelming as the numbers indicated. His interrogators exchange glances. They've encountered this denial repeatedly from captured Japanese officers, a refusal to acknowledge reality even when evidence is irrefutable. The institutional delusion that characterized Japanese naval leadership didn't end with surrender. It persists in interrogation rooms where defeated admirals reconstruct alternate histories, where their decisions were correct and only fortune was cruel. The Army-Navy rivalry that plagued Japan's war effort emerges in post-war interrogations as even more destructive than Allied intelligence suspected. The services operated as separate fiefdoms, competing for resources, refusing intelligence sharing, and actually sabotaging each other's operations through non-cooperation. Both services developed independent aircraft programs, duplicating research efforts and splitting scarce resources. They refused to coordinate operations. The Army's conquest of Southeast Asia proceeded with minimal naval input, while naval operations in the Solomons occurred with virtually no Army support. Even communication was problematic. The services used different codes, meaning they often couldn't read each other's messages. Admiral Soemu Toyota's post-war testimony includes the stunning admission that combined fleet headquarters sometimes learned about Army operations from Allied radio broadcasts rather than through Japanese channels. Admiral Yonai Mitsumasa, who served as both Navy Minister and Prime Minister during the war, tells interrogators flatly, "Japan defeated herself." The rivalry was so severe that neither service would share shipping with the other, leading to situations where Army transports sailed half empty, while Navy units starved for supplies on the same islands. November 1945. Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, former Chief of Staff to Admiral Koga, provides testimony that shocks American analysts. When questioned about Japanese understanding of American industrial capacity, Fukudome admits the Naval General Staff consistently discounted American production statistics. Intelligence reports showing American shipyards building carriers every 2 months were dismissed as misinformation. Claims that American aircraft production exceeded 80,000 planes annually were considered propaganda designed to damage Japanese morale. Naval leadership convinced themselves that Americans lacked the discipline and work ethic for sustained industrial mobilization. This wasn't intelligence failure. They received accurate reports. It was willful self-deception, rejecting information that contradicted desired narratives. Fukudome describes planning sessions where junior officers presented data on American production increases, only to be silenced by senior admirals who insisted such figures were impossible. The institutional culture actively suppressed accurate intelligence assessments, preferring comforting lies to uncomfortable truths. You cannot win a war when your planning is based on wishful thinking rather than reality. The decisive battle obsession that dominated Japanese naval doctrine received scathing analysis in post-war studies. Between 1942 and 1944, junior officers proposed 23 separate strategic plans emphasizing defensive operations, resource conservation, and attrition warfare. All were rejected by the Naval General Staff, which insisted on maintaining offensive posture, seeking the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle that would annihilate American naval power in single engagement. Even after Midway demonstrated that decisive battles could go either way, even after Guadalcanal showed that attrition favored America, even after Philippine Sea proved Japanese forces were outmatched, senior admirals continued planning for the climactic engagement that would reverse Japan's fortunes. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai tells interrogators that Navy leadership was still discussing Kantai-Kessen scenarios in July 1945, 1 month before surrender, when Japan's Navy was effectively non-existent. The doctrine wasn't just flawed, it was psychologically pathological, an institutional delusion that prevented rational strategic adjustment even when survival depended on it. The surrender question haunts interrogations. American intelligence wants to know when Japanese leadership recognized defeat was inevitable. Or the answers are disturbing. Most admirals privately believed the war was unwinnable by late 1943, when the American production advantage became undeniable. Some, including Yamamoto, knew from the beginning that extended war meant certain defeat, yet none advocated surrender or even peace negotiations before August 1945. When asked why, the admirals cite Bushido, the samurai code that views surrender as ultimate dishonor. Admiral Soemu Toyoda explains that proposing peace negotiations would have been career suicide at minimum, possibly literal suicide if hardliners viewed it as treason. The institutional culture made rational strategic assessment impossible. Officers knew Japan was losing, but couldn't say so because admitting defeat violated cultural norms more important than survival. Yet this created organizational psychosis, where everyone privately understood the situation was hopeless, but publicly maintained the fiction that victory remained possible. Hundreds of thousands died in the war's final year because naval leadership couldn't psychologically accept what their intellect understood. December 1945. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey begins comprehensive analysis of Japan's defeat. Interrogators question Admiral Yonai extensively about decision-making processes. His testimony reveals that Japan had an 18-month window after Pearl Harbor to consolidate conquests and negotiate peace from a position of strength. Instead, the military continued offensive operations, overextending supply lines and consuming irreplaceable resources. Why? Yonai explains that stopping the offensive would have required admitting the war couldn't be won militarily, an admission the culture wouldn't permit. So operations continued based not on strategic logic, but on institutional momentum and psychological inability to acknowledge limits. The Navy expanded the defensive perimeter because contraction implied weakness. They attacked Midway because remaining passive seemed cowardly. They fought at Guadalcanal because abandoning it without battle violated Bushido. Strategic rationality took second place to cultural requirements, with predictably catastrophic results. The intelligence failures extend beyond production statistics into operational security. Japanese communication security was comprehensively breached from early 1942 onward. That American codebreakers read substantial portions of Japanese naval traffic throughout the war. The JN-25 Naval Code was never truly secure. Interrogators asked repeatedly whether Japanese cryptanalysts suspected their codes were broken. Some did. Technical experts warned that code security might be compromised. These warnings were ignored by commanders who couldn't accept that American mathematicians might be smarter than Japanese officers. The cultural assumption of Japanese superiority trumped technical reality. Admiral Toyota admits in interrogation that he never seriously considered the possibility of American code breaking until after the war, when told explicitly. This meant every major Japanese operation proceeded with Americans reading their plans in advance. Midway, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, all benefited from intelligence derived from code breaking that Japanese leadership refused to believe was possible. The cognitive dissonance required to ignore this vulnerability bordered on delusional. March 1946. Admiral Chester Nimitz reviews interrogation transcripts from dozens of Japanese admirals and staff officers. The pattern he identifies is consistent. Institutional inflexibility, cultural priorities overriding strategic logic, systematic rejection of uncomfortable intelligence, and psychological inability to adapt when facing unexpected opposition. Nimitz writes in his analysis, "The Japanese fought magnificently at the tactical level, but failed comprehensively at the strategic level. Their junior officers and enlisted men displayed courage and skill rarely equaled. Their senior leadership displayed incompetence rarely exceeded. The assessment is harsh, but supported by evidence. Japanese admirals made virtually every major strategic mistake possible, dispersing forces rather than concentrating them, prioritizing symbolic objectives over strategic ones, continuing offensives beyond sustainable limits, refusing to establish defensive postures, maintaining rigid doctrine despite evidence of its failure, and valuing cultural honor over rational self-interest. Any single mistake might have been recoverable. The cumulative effect guaranteed defeat." The final question haunting post-war analysis: could different leadership have salvaged Japanese prospects? The consensus answer is no. Industrial and resource disparities were too vast for leadership to overcome. But different leadership might have limited the damage significantly. A defensive strategy in mid-1942, consolidating the defensive perimeter and forcing America to attack across thousands of miles, would have extended the war substantially and increased American casualties. Realistic assessment of American production capacity might have prompted earlier peace negotiations when terms would have been less harsh. Proper resource allocation instead of battleship and carrier construction might have strengthened submarine defenses and saved merchant shipping. Flexible doctrine allowing adaptation to circumstances might have prevented catastrophic losses at Midway and Philippine Sea. The admirals who lost the war didn't lose because they were stupid or incompetent individually. They lost because they operated within an institutional and cultural framework that made rational strategic decision-making impossible. They were intelligent men trapped in a system that punished intelligence and rewarded conformity to doctrines that reality had invalidated. They couldn't save Japan because the culture they served valued honor more than survival. And honor, as defined by Bushido and imperial ideology, required fighting to destruction rather than negotiating reasonable peace. The admirals lost the war not through individual failures, but through collective inability to transcend cultural limitations that made defeat inevitable once America decided to win. That's the tragedy. Not that they lost, but that they couldn't even try to win rationally because their culture wouldn't permit it. December the 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns, while Admiral Chuichi Nagumo considers launching a third strike against fuel storage tanks and repair facilities. He decides against it, withdrawing without completing the mission, believing he's achieved sufficient success. Flash forward to December the 7th, 1945. USS Missouri sits in Tokyo Bay, the most visible symbol of American victory. Between these two December 7ths lie 4 years of war that mathematics determined from the beginning. Place the images side by side, burning battleships at Pearl Harbor versus Missouri's triumph in Tokyo Bay, and the arc from hubris to devastation becomes crystal clear. Japan's early victories were real, impressive, and ultimately meaningless. They won tactical engagements while losing the strategic war from day one. The question was never whether Japan would lose, and it was how long the losing would take, and how many would die before arithmetic finished its inexorable work. The production statistics tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1942, Japan produced 8,861 aircraft. America produced 47,836, a 5-to-1 advantage. By 1944, American production reached 85,898 aircraft, while Japan's output actually declined to 28,180 due to bombing and resource shortages, a 3-to-1 advantage that would have been worse, except that America was also fighting Germany. Ship production showed even wider disparities. Japan commissioned 6 fleet carriers during the entire war. America built 17 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, and 122 escort carriers in under 4 years, a ratio so lopsided that comparison becomes almost absurd. Steel production in 1942, United States 81.2 million tons, Japan 7.8 million tons. The ratio stayed constant throughout the war. Japan was fighting a nation that outproduced them 10-to-1 in virtually every category of military material. No amount of courage, tactical brilliance, or fighting spirit could overcome disparities this vast. The human cost of the war's mathematical inevitability staggers the imagination. Japanese losses totaled over 300,000 naval personnel killed, 40% casualty rate among those who served. Add merchant mariners, and the death toll exceeds 360,000. All American naval and marine losses in the Pacific totaled approximately 56,000 killed. Both numbers are tragic. The disparity reveals how Japan's strategic position translated to human cost. America could afford losses because replacement systems existed, training programs, reserve forces, industrial capacity to rebuild. Japan lost irreplaceable personnel in battles they couldn't avoid without surrendering the empire that motivated the war in the first place. Every engagement after Midway traded lives. Japan couldn't replace for time. America could use to build more ships, train more pilots, and prepare more invasions. The mathematics were fatal, not just to strategy, but to hundreds of thousands of individual lives sacrificed to a cause arithmetic had already doomed. The timeline of inevitable defeat shows Japan's window of opportunity closing rapidly. Pearl Harbor through May 1942. Japan operates with impunity, conquering vast territories. June 1942, Midway. Carrier force crippled, initiative lost, defensive posture forced. August 1942 through February 1943, Guadalcanal. Attrition warfare that Japan cannot sustain, proving that tactical draws become strategic defeats when you can't replace losses. By March 1943, the question isn't whether Japan can win, but how long they can delay defeat. June 1944, Philippine Sea. Naval aviation destroyed as effective force. October 1944, Leyte Gulf. Combined fleet annihilated as fighting entity. By January 1945, Japan's navy exists only nominally. The surrender in August merely formalizes what mathematics determined 3 years earlier. Every battle after mid-1943 was just subtraction, removing Japanese capability that couldn't regenerate. The counterfactual analysis reveals how overdetermined Japanese defeat was. Suppose Japan won at Midway, sinking American carriers without losing their own. The production gap still means American numerical superiority by mid-1943. Suppose Japan implemented defensive strategy, fortifying the perimeter. American industrial capacity enables island-hopping campaigns that bypass strong points. Suppose Japan developed radar comparable to American systems. The oil shortage still strangles operations by 1944. Suppose Japanese pilot training maintained quality. Fuel shortages limit flight hours, all producing similar quality decline by different mechanism. Suppose damage control matched American standards. The submarine campaign still destroys merchant shipping and strangles the economy. Every single Japanese weakness could theoretically be fixed, but fixing them all simultaneously requires resources, technology, and industrial capacity Japan didn't possess. The arithmetic wasn't just fatal, it was multiply redundant, guaranteeing defeat through multiple independent mechanisms. The fundamental strategic error was Japan's decision to fight at all. Admiral Yamamoto understood this, telling Prime Minister Konoe that Japan could run wild for 6 to 12 months, but had no expectation of success in extended war. The assessment was accurate. The Japanese strategic planning assumed that early victories would somehow convince America to negotiate rather than fight. This assumption had zero basis in American political culture or historical precedent. Once America committed to total war, Japanese defeat became mathematical certainty. The only rational decision was never attacking in the first place, but domestic political pressures and military leadership who believed in cultural and spiritual superiority over material factors made restraint impossible. Japan talked itself into a war that arithmetic predetermined they would lose, motivated by ideology that made accurate assessment of American capabilities psychologically impossible. They fought because not fighting seemed dishonorable, knowing the fight was probably unwinnable, and unable to accept what that knowledge meant for strategic planning. The technological disparities compounded industrial advantages throughout the war. American radar allowed night operations and beyond visual range engagement. Proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells multiplied defensive effectiveness. Advanced damage control saved ships that would have sunk. Code breaking provided strategic intelligence that enabled ambushes. Each technological advantage multiplied force effectiveness, meaning the numerical superiority understates true capability differences. A single American carrier task force in 1944 was more militarily effective than the entire Japanese carrier fleet in 1942, despite having fewer ships, because technology, training, and logistics made each unit vastly more capable. Though this phenomenon accelerated throughout the war, American equipment improved continuously, while Japanese equipment stagnated or declined. By 1945, American destroyers routinely defeated Japanese cruisers through technological superiority despite tonnage disadvantage. The arithmetic wasn't just about numbers. It was about those numbers representing increasingly superior capability over time. The economic dimension reveals how thoroughly doomed Japanese prospects were. Japan's entire 1941 through 1945 war expenditure totaled approximately $41 billion, an enormous sum that strained Japan's economy to breaking point. American Pacific Theater spending alone exceeded $100 billion during the same period. The United States was fighting a two-ocean war against Japan and Germany simultaneously, while outspending Japan 3-1 in the Pacific Theater alone. American civilians experienced rationing and shortages, but never approached the desperation of Japanese civilians, eating bark and sawdust by 1945. The economic comparison shows that America fought World War II while maintaining civilian living standards far above Japanese military sustainability. One nation was engaged in total war, the other was engaged in industrial production that happened to include military equipment. The difference meant everything. The institutional culture dimension explains why Japan couldn't adapt to mathematical realities their intelligence assessments identified. Japanese officers understood by mid-1943 that they were losing. Yes, they couldn't say so because institutional culture punished defeatism more harshly than it punished failure. This created organizational paralysis where rational strategic adjustment became impossible despite everyone privately understanding its necessity. American military culture, pragmatic and engineering-focused, adapted continuously. Tactics that failed got replaced. Equipment that underperformed got improved. Doctrine that proved flawed got rewritten. Japanese military culture, honor-focused and tradition-bound, maintained failed doctrines because changing them implied previous approaches were wrong, an admission that violated cultural values. The mathematical inevitability of defeat was clear to those who looked honestly at the numbers. Japanese institutional culture made honest assessment impossible, all ensuring the war continued until arithmetic finished its work, regardless of how many died in the interim. The final analysis of why Japan lost naval superiority shows over a dozen independent factors, each sufficient to cause serious problems. collectively creating an inescapable trap: production disparity, resource shortage, technological inferiority, training system collapse, doctrinal rigidity, intelligence failures, damage control weakness, submarine vulnerability, geographic disadvantage, industrial vulnerability, cultural limitations preventing adaptation, strategic incoherence in the war's final years, and underlying everything, the fundamental arithmetic. Japan needed to win quickly or not at all, because extended war meant facing an opponent with 10 times their production capacity, infinite resources by comparison, though technological superiority that increased over time, and geographic advantages that made blockade inevitable. The war lasted from December 1941 to August 1945, 3 years, 8 months, far longer than Japan's 6-month window. Once that window closed at Midway, defeat wasn't just probable. It was mathematically certain, determined by equations that courage and sacrifice could not solve. Japan fought on for 3 more years, dying slowly, because institutional culture wouldn't permit surrender, and individual courage couldn't overcome industrial arithmetic. The tragedy isn't that they lost, it's that they lost in ways that anyone capable of basic mathematics could have predicted from the beginning, making every death after June 1942 a sacrifice to cultural values that prioritized honor over survival. The arithmetic was always fatal. Japan just refused to accept the calculation until the sum was paid, in cities burned, ships sunk, and hundreds of thousands dead. The mathematics finished their work. The equation balanced. The answer was defeat, total and inevitable, determined before the first shot was fired.